33 years. She was proud to be able to teach life skills like budgeting, simple cooking, and social skills to her students who may not ever be college ready. We worry about those kids and what will become of them if Ms. DeVos is confirmed. My husband is currently employed in a collaborative that works with mentally ill children who need a different kind of educational process, but can still achieve the same goals. I am not sure they would ever qualify for a voucher to attend some charter school. We are committed to families and community maintenance of all students with the right care at the right time. I am not sure that Ms. DeVos is committed in the same way. Please vote to oppose Ms. DeVos. Thank you, Liz. Thanks for writing. I heard from another student in Boston who told me the following. I am writing you today as a public school teacher and a PhD candidate in urban education, leadership, and policy studies. I believe in public schools. Betsy DeVos believes in school privatization and vouchers. She has worked to undermine efforts to regulate Michigan charters, even when they clearly fail. The marketplace solutions of DeVos will destroy our democratically governed community schools. She has no professional experience in the education field. She does not truly understand the nuances of public education, nor does she want to understand. I managed to earn scholarships that took care of most of my schooling, but I still have about $80,000 in student loans. Not bad for 2 expensive private institution degrees. I am a first-generation college student, and my single mother could not afford to help me pay for my schooling. Betsy DeVos just doesn't have experience in K-12 public schools, but she has no experience in running the student loan department. The federal student loan program is far from perfect. We need someone running it who is knowledgeable in the process, who believes in making college more affordable, and who understands what it feels like not to be sure how you will pay for college. She has no qualifications of any kind in this area. I am asking you to vote against the confirmation of Betsy DeVos. Please consider this request and the thousands of other people across the country who vehemently disagree with Ms. DeVos's candidacy. Thank you. Sarah Rothery, a mother of 2 from Northborough, told me about her 2 sons, saying, I'm writing to ask that you oppose the confirmation of Ms. DeVos for the cabinet position for which she was nominated under President Trump. I have put 2 sons through college thanks to Stafford loans and personal savings, and I think she has no idea what is involved in middle-class families financing college educations today. One of my sons is now an 8th grade history teacher in the public charter school, Abby Kelly Foster in Worcester, and worries that Ms. DeVos has no real understanding of urban education as well. Thank you, Sarah. Thanks for writing. I have also heard from Alicia Betano. Sorry about that, Alicia. A former student from Merrimack who bravely shared with me her own experiences. This is from Alicia. I suffer from a nonverbal learning disorder. Up until I was 13 years old, I was not diagnosed with anything. I went to aides, speech therapists, everyone. I had trouble in math and sciences. I was thought of as stupid. I was yelled at by aides. When I was 13 and diagnosed, my teachers didn't understand. They thought sitting me closer to the whiteboard would allow me to understand better, despite the fact that it was their teaching methods that confused me. I was told I would not go to college or graduate. My parents had to hire an advocate to work for me to get my teachers in school to understand my disability. It took me some time to figure out what I wanted and needed. But in May, I graduated college. Betsy DeVos would be a horror for those with disabilities, not just learning ones, but mental ones. I was lucky I had parents and one teacher backing me. But what about the ones that don't? Putting Betsy DeVos into office will hurt our children in America. That's not making America great. Alicia, thank you for writing. I really appreciate it. And congratulations on your graduation. A man from Brookline also wrote in saying this: as someone passionate about education, especially the education of students in Massachusetts, as a graduate of a public elementary school, middle school, high school, and college, as a young professional burdened by education debt, as the husband of an early childhood educator working in struggling Boston neighborhood, as a member of a family filled with men and women dedicated to careers in public education, I strongly urge you to oppose Secretary of Education nominee Betsy DeVos. My vote for or against candidates in future elections will be informed by whether the candidate publicly opposed this Secretary of Education nominee. Betsy DeVos has consistently worked against public education, and she is incredibly unqualified for this position. At best, she should be an undersecretary focused on public-private partnerships. If you must work with the incoming administration, suggest her nomination for that role, but you must oppose her cabinet-level appointment. DeVos has no experience in public schools, either as a student, educator, administrator, or even as a parent. She has lobbied for and been employed by initiatives that have undermined public education in America. We need a Secretary of Education who will champion innovative strategies that we know help to improve success for all students, including creating more opportunities and equity for all. Your vote, I urge you to vote against Ms. DeVos for Secretary of Education. Now, what does Betsy DeVos have to say to Matt and Diana, or to the thousands of other teachers who have more experience in public education than she does? What does she have to say to Leslie and Samantha, whose children have benefited from the programs she wants to cut? What does she have to say to Sarah, who relied on Stafford loans to put her sons through college? And it's not just individuals who are worried about Betsy DeVos. We've heard from groups across the state as well. The Massachusetts Charter Public School Association wrote me saying this: Dear Senator Warren, as the association representing the 70 Massachusetts Commonwealth Charter Public Schools, we are writing to express our concerns over the nomination of Elizabeth DeVos as U.S. Secretary of Education. We do not express these reservations lightly, but we believe it is important to raise certain issues that should be addressed by the nominee. Both President-elect Trump and Ms. DeVos are strong supporters of public charter schools, and we are hopeful they will continue the bipartisan efforts of the Clinton, Bush, and Obama administrations to promote the continued expansion of high-quality charters while pursuing reforms that will strengthen traditional public schools. But we are concerned about media reports of Ms. DeVos's support for school vouchers and her critical role in creating a charter system in her home state of Michigan that has been widely criticized for lax oversight and poor academic performance, and appears to be dominated by for-profit interests. As the senior senator from Massachusetts and a member of the U.S. Senate Committee on Health, Education, Labor, and Pensions, HELP, which will hold hearings on the nomination, you will be in a position to ensure the nominee commits to holding the national charter school movement to the highest levels of accountability and oversight that are the hallmark of the Massachusetts charter system. By all independent accounts, Massachusetts has the best charter school system in the country. We are providing high-quality public school choices for parents across our state. Our urban schools are serving the highest need of children in Massachusetts and are producing results that have researchers double-checking their math. These gains held across all demographic groups, including African American, Latino, and children living in poverty. The cornerstone of the Massachusetts charter public school system is accountability. The process of obtaining and keeping a charter is deliberately difficult. The State Board of Elementary and Secondary Education is the sole authorizer and historically has approved only 1 out of every 5 applications. Once approved, each charter school must submit to annual financial audits by independent auditors and annual performance reviews by the State Department of Elementary and Secondary Education. Every 5 years, each charter must be renewed after a process as rigorous as the initial application process. For-profit charter schools are prohibited by Massachusetts law. Our schools have also created partnerships with many Massachusetts public school districts to foster collaboration and best practices sharing, and have forged an historic compact between Boston Charter Public Schools and the Boston Public Schools that has become a national model. Bipartisan support has been key to the development and success of the Massachusetts system. Created in 1993 by a Democratic legislature and a Republican governor, public charter schools have continued to receive support from all governors, Republican and Democratic alike, and Democratic legislative leaders. If the new president and his nominee intend to advance the cause of school choice across the country, they should look to Massachusetts for their path forward. The history of charter schools in Michigan offers a more cautionary tale. The same researchers from Stanford that declared Massachusetts charter public schools an unqualified success had mixed reviews for Michigan's charters. According to media reports, last year, Ms. DeVos actively campaigned against bipartisan legislation that would have provided more oversight for Michigan's charters. If these reports are true, we are deeply concerned that efforts to grow school choice without a rigorous accountability system will reduce the quality of charter schools across the country. We hope you agree that quality, not quantity, should be the guiding principle of charter expansion. Without high levels of accountability, this model fails. We ask that you use the hearing to probe the incoming administration's intentions regarding education policy in general and school choice and quality specifically. We'd be happy to provide you with more information on the Massachusetts model and would welcome a meeting with your staff to brief them on our concerns. Sincerely, Massachusetts Charter Public School Association Board of Directors. The people of Massachusetts cannot afford Betsy DeVos, and this is why I will vote no on her nomination and why I urge my colleagues to do the same. Mr. President, I yield the floor.
Mr. President.
Majority Leader.
I have one request for committees to meet during today's session of the Senate. Has the approval of the majority and minority leaders.
Duly noted.
Now, Mr. President, President Trump's outstanding Supreme Court nominee, Neil Gorsuch, has earned high praise from all across the political spectrum. Some of it has come from unlikely corners, whether Democratic senators, left-leaning publications, former President Obama's own legal mentor, even his former top Supreme Court lawyer. We've heard from those Gorsuch has taught. We've heard from many who've worked alongside him. In fact, just a few days ago, we received a letter from several of his former law colleagues. So let me share some of that with you now. We're Democrats, independents, and Republicans. The letter began. Many of us have served in government, some during Republican, some during Democratic administrations. Some of us have served in both. We've clerked for Supreme Court justices and appellate and district court judges appointed by Democratic and Republican presidents. We represent a broad spectrum of views on politics, judicial philosophy, and many other subjects as well. But we all agree on one thing. Our former colleague, Neil Gorsuch, is superbly qualified for confirmation. He's a man of character, decency, and accomplishment. One who represented all of his clients without regard to ideology, and one who merits this appointment. Clearly, it's not going to be easy to paint Judge Gorsuch as anything but extremely qualified and exceptionally fair. But that hadn't stopped some on the left from trying. They started musing about blocking any nominee before the president had nominated anyone. It's a good reminder that much of the opposition we're seeing from far-left groups and Democratic senators isn't so much about Judge Gorsuch as it's about their dissatisfaction with the outcome of the election. As a Washington Post headline recently declared, Democrats' goal with court nomination, make it a referendum on Trump. Prominent Senate Democrats, the article read, are giving the nominees 10-plus years on the U.S. Court of Appeals for the 10th Circuit.
So, Madam President, I come to the floor to
consideration. It seems they believe their best and perhaps only bet to bring down this highly qualified judge is by injecting Trump into the process. The very next day, the New York Times ran an article about Democrats' apparent hope that this Supreme Court fight will be more about Trump than Gorsuch. In other words, our Democratic colleagues are finding it hard to oppose Judge Gorsuch on the merits, so they're trying to divert attention and invent new hurdles for him to surmount. That's the playbook. Sure enough, we see them running the play. Consider the Assistant Democratic Leader's speech the other day. It was supposedly about Judge Gorsuch. He sure had a lot to say about President Trump, about things President Trump has done, about things President Trump might do, about refighting old battles, but precious little about the qualifications of the actual nominee before us, and precious little about the increasing number of accolades he's been receiving, especially from well-known folks on the political left. I mentioned several a moment ago. Now we can add another to the list, Alan Dershowitz, a famous constitutional scholar and longtime Harvard law professor. Dershowitz described Gorsuch as highly credentialed and hard to oppose, and dismissed the idea that he would be caricatured as some sort of extreme right-wing ideologue. That doesn't seem to fit what I know about him, Dershowitz said, adding that Gorsuch will be hard to oppose on the merits. Indeed, he will. That's precisely why our Democratic colleagues are making the debate on his nomination about other things and other people. That's also why they're arguing that there are special hurdles for Judge Gorsuch to clear, hurdles that they are forced to admit were not there for the first-term nominees of Democratic presidents. When even a left-winger like Rachel Maddow can't help but admit that Judge Gorsuch is a relatively mainstream choice, when even Maddow characterizes a Democratic attempt to filibuster his nomination as radical, it's hard to argue otherwise. Now, that won't stop many on the far left from trying. I invite Democrats who spend many months insisting we need 9 to now follow through on that advice by giving this superbly qualified nominee fair consideration and an up or down vote. It's time to finally accept the result of the election and move on so we can all move our country forward. Now, that would also apply to other nominations before the Senate. Just before the election, the Democratic leader said he believed the Senate had a moral obligation, even beyond the economy and politics, to avoid gridlock. Put simply, he said, we have to get things done. And yet, just a few months later, Democrat obstruction has reached new extreme levels that the smallest number of cabinet officials have been confirmed in modern history at this point in a presidency. It's a historic break in tradition. a departure from how newly elected presidents of both parties have been treated in decades past. In fact, by this same point into their terms, other recent presidents from both sides of the aisle had more than twice as many cabinet officials confirmed as President Trump does now. President Obama had 12 cabinet officials confirmed at this point in his term. President George W. Bush had all 14 cabinet nominees confirmed at this point. President Clinton had 13. President Trump has a mere 4. Well, Mr. President, it seems this gridlock in opposition has far less to do with the nominees actually before us than the man who nominated them, just like we're seeing with President Trump's outstanding Supreme Court pick. The Democratic leader and his colleagues are under a great deal of pressure from those on the left who simply cannot accept the results of a Democratic election. They're calling for Democrats to delay and punt and blockade the serious work of the Senate at any cost. They would like nothing more than for Democrats to continue to resist and prevent this president from moving our country forward. Unfortunately, many of our friends across the aisle have given in to these groups' calls for obstruction, and some have even gone to unprecedented lengths to delay for delay's sake. They've forced meaningless procedural hurdles. They've stalled confirmation votes as long as possible. They've postponed hearings, and they've even boycotted committee meetings altogether. Their excuses are ever-changing, at some border on the absurd. We don't like the seating arrangement, they say. We can't be late to a protest, they argue. There was even some excuse about a YouTube video. Look, enough is enough. The American people elected a new president last November. Democrats don't have to like that decision, but they do have a responsibility to our country. American people want us to bring the nation together and move forward. It's far past time to put the election behind us and put this president's cabinet into place, just as previous Senates have done for previous newly elected presidents of both parties. Now, I'd like to say a few words about one nominee who we'll be voting on tomorrow. The nominee for Education Secretary, Betsy DeVos, is a well-qualified candidate who earned the support of 20 governors and several education groups from across the nation. As Education Secretary, she'll be our students' foremost advocate, working to improve our education system so that every child has a brighter future. Importantly, she also understands that our teachers, students, parents, school boards, and local and state governments are best suited to make education decisions, not Washington bureaucrats. I have every confidence that Ms. DeVos will lead the Department of Education in such a way that will put our students' interests first, while also strengthening the educational opportunities available to all of America's children. So I would urge colleagues to join in confirming Betsy DeVos so that she can begin the very important work before her without further delay.
President.
Senator from Texas.
Mr. President, I sat here and listened with interest to the Majority Leader's comments about this strategy of obstruction and slow walking the President's cabinet. And I share his frustration, but more than that, I regret on behalf of the people we were sent here to represent, the American people, that petty politics has gotten in the way of our colleagues across the aisle's ability just to get over the fact that the election didn't turn out quite the way they hoped and to get back to work on behalf of the American people. So this week we'll continue to grind our way through consideration of President Trump's nominees despite the best efforts of our friends across the aisle to obstruct and to slow walk. Because of their insistence on taking advantage of every possible procedural delay, they've tried to grind the Senate into a near halt. But we've overcome that obstruction, and of course, we came together early Friday morning and voted to move forward with the President's nominee for Education Secretary about 6:30 in the morning, a little earlier than we're usually convened, but I'm glad we were able to get it done. So I'm confident that we'll get Ms. DeVos confirmed soon. Then, thanks to former Democratic leader Harry Reid, the Democrats know they cannot block these nominees from taking office. Because of the so-called nuclear option, they reduced the voting threshold from 60 to 51, meaning that with 52 Republicans and hopefully a little help from some of our friends across the aisle, every single one of President Trump's cabinet nominees will be confirmed. We can take that to the bank. So all they can do, which is all they have done to this point, is to slow the process down for no reason other than the fact that they can. Again, thanks to Senator Reid, all of the President's nominees will be confirmed. But this type of behavior is really pretty juvenile, if you ask me, and it can't actually accomplish anything. It's a strategy in search of a goal. They don't have any particular goal in mind, because at the end of the day, the President will get the cabinet that he has nominated and deserves. So after we follow the vote tomorrow on Ms. DeVos for Cabinet Secretary of Education, we'll vote to confirm Senator Sessions, our colleague of long standing, as Attorney General. And in addition to him, the Education Secretary, the Secretaries of Health and Human Services, and the Secretary of Treasury, too. These, of course, are key positions in the new administration. And now, 18 days after President Trump's inauguration, he still doesn't have the help he needs in these critical posts. I believe this kind of mindless obstruction is actually irresponsible, if not downright dangerous. Now, I know our Democratic colleagues said that, well, they confirmed General Mattis, the Secretary of Defense, and later on the Secretary or the Director of the CIA, and yes, they finally confirmed the Secretary of State. But the Attorney General is part of the National Security Cabinet. They run a lot of the counterterrorism efforts for the Department of Justice. So this is not only irresponsible, this is, I believe, dangerous. It should also be an embarrassment. The American people expect their senators and Congress to do our jobs and fulfill the duties to those who we represent. Now, if our Democratic colleagues don't want to support one of the very well-qualified nominees of the President, well, that's fine. That is their right. But don't slow walk and slow down the institution of the Senate just to score some political points or to feed some of the irrational rage that you see depicted in some quarters. Dragging this out doesn't do any good. It won't change the outcome, and it ill serves the American people. So let's get these nominations done so they can be sworn in and begin their service to this new administration and, more importantly, to the American people. In addition to our work on nominations, last week the Senate started to consider a number of measures to block a host of regulations put in place by the Obama administration during the last 6 months that President Obama was in office. Under President Obama, our country witnessed a volcanic profusion of rules and regulations that empowered unelected bureaucrats and shut out the voices of the elected representatives of the people. The result? Well, job creators have less freedom to operate and innovate and are instead suffocated by more and more red tape and compliance costs. That translates into a slower growing economy, which means less jobs, which means the American people are the ones who get hurt directly as a result of this profusion of red tape and regulation. According to recent reports, the 600-plus regulations issued by the Obama White House came with a $700 billion price tag for our economy. Our economy is not even growing at 2%. And I think this overregulation is largely responsible, because this profusion of regulations hit businesses both big that can absorb some of the costs, but also small businesses, including local community banks that are going out of business on a daily basis because they simply can't afford to compete and to pay for the accountants and lawyers to comply with all of the red tape and the mindless regulation from the previous administration. But it's not just financial services, it's healthcare and it's agriculture, it's all sectors of the economy. I am grateful that President Trump has made it clear where he stands on all this, and he's already issued guidance requiring the government to cut regulations should it want to add more. Cut 2 regulations for every one you want to add. With President Trump at the White House, Congress can reverse many of the Obama regulations and give the American people and our anemic economic growth some relief. Through the Congressional Review Act, Congress can review and ultimately block recent regulations handed down by the federal government. And that's what we did last week, and that's what we're going to continue to do. We can roll back many of the Obama administration rules that are killing jobs and stifling economic growth. So at the end of last week, we repealed a rule called the stream buffer rule, which actually didn't have anything to do with streams. It was a job-killing regulation that was more about stifling domestic energy production, and I'm glad we did away with it. And on Friday, Congress passed another resolution, one I was happy to co-sponsor, one that was aimed at chipping away the regulatory burdens for our community banks and other financial services organizations brought on by Dodd-Frank. I'm all for transparency, but I'm against laws that give advantages to foreign companies over our own. This Securities and Exchange Commission rule would have done that by forcing American companies to disclose confidential information that their foreign competitors can keep under wraps. It should go without saying that each of us want a level playing field for our businesses that help create jobs and grow the economy. That's why we blocked this rule. Of course, this and other resolutions are just the first few steps in a broader strategy to kill overbearing regulations so that our innovators, our entrepreneurs aren't suffocated by unnecessary paperwork and bureaucracy. That's part of what the American people sent us here to do. And certainly the verdict they rendered on November the 8th is that they did not want a continuation of the status quo under the previous administration. They wanted change. And it's integral to restoring our economy, the kind of change we're bringing about, to restoring our economy and helping it grow for everyone. So I look forward to working with the White House, with our colleagues, as we continue to find new ways to build up the American economy. If I can just close, Mr. President, on one last topic. I see some colleagues here wishing to speak. Tomorrow we'll vote on the nomination of Betsy DeVos to the Department of Education. The federal government, through the Department of Education, funds about 10% of public education because most of that comes from our states. That is the funding and the regulation of education from kindergarten through 12th grade. But what this fight over this well-qualified nominee is all about, it's about power, as so many of these fights in Washington, D.C. are about, and the desire to keep power over public education in all of our states, all across the country, right here inside the Beltway. I believe President Trump chose wisely, not because he chose another education bureaucrat that knows all the acronyms and knows the arcana known to people that have been brought up within that establishment. Instead, he chose an outsider, someone much like himself, but someone more interested in results rather than paying homage to and feeding the education establishment here in Washington, D.C., and retaining the power over the important decisions that should be handed back down to the states, down to teachers and parents and students as they choose how best to get to accomplish our universal goal of making sure every child has a good education. But this fight isn't about the quality of education in our country. This fight, for those who are opposing Ms. DeVos, is largely about should we retain power here in Washington, D.C., so that Washington can continue to dictate to the states, to parents, to teachers, what policies they need to apply in our K through 12 education system, or whether we're going to return that power back where it should be, back into the hands of parents and teachers and in local school districts. That's what this fight's all about. So that's why I'm glad tomorrow we will confirm Betsy DeVos as Secretary of Education. Listen to what the American people told us on November the 8th when they said they don't want to maintain the status quo because the status quo is not working for them, it's not working for our economy, and certainly not working for our children, each of whom deserve a good education. So yes, Ms. DeVos is going to shake things up a little bit, but more importantly, she's going to be part of this effort to return power to parents and teachers and to our local school districts. That's what this vote will be about tomorrow. Mr. President, I yield the floor.
Mr. President.
The senator from Utah.
Mr. President, I rise today to briefly discuss a number of ongoing efforts here in the early days of the 115th Congress. It is a strange time to be working on Capitol Hill, as strange as I've seen in my 4 decades here in the Senate. That's true for a number of reasons. Let me give you an example. Republicans currently control the Senate, the House of Representatives, and the White House, and are in widespread agreement about most major policy issues. Sure, there are details that need to be worked out, both on the process and the substance, on things like tax reform, trade, and of course, health care reform. But by and large, Republicans all have the same ultimate goals for these key areas. Yet, despite the overwhelming consensus that exists on most of these issues, there seems to be an obsession with advancing a narrative of a deeply divided Republican majority. According to this popular narrative, House and Senate Republicans have completely different views on tax reform. Republicans in Congress oppose everything President Trump wants to do on trade, and Senate Republicans are deeply at odds on how to press forward on repealing and replacing Obamacare. As chairman of the Senate committee that is right in the middle of all these issues, I get asked to comment on these matters literally dozens of times every day. The questions take many forms. Senator X says Congress should do blank with Obamacare. What do you think? Can the House's tax reform plan pass in the Senate? President Trump said blank today. Is that going to fly in your committee? These questions may seem petty. They may seem pretty straightforward. However, the underlying question behind all of these lines of inquiry are, will you publicly disagree with or criticize another Republican so we can write another story about Republican divisions? Matters such as repealing and replacing Obamacare or reforming the tax code are certainly important topics that are rightly under intense public scrutiny. However, given that these monumental efforts are still in the early stages, the fact that there are some relatively minor differences of opinion shouldn't be all that noteworthy. And the existence of these differences in the initial stages of the process doesn't significantly jeopardize the success of these efforts. The purpose of the legislative process, particularly the process we use here in the Senate, is to allow differences to be aired and worked through so that at the end of the process, consensus can be reached. Differing views on some issues at the beginning of the process are to be expected. And once again, they are hardly noteworthy. Case in point, Republicans are united in our desire to repeal and replace Obamacare. The vast majority of us want reforms that are more patient-centered and market-driven, and as far as I know, pretty much all of us want to return most of the authority for regulating the health care system back to the states. On some of the other questions, let me make clear what my position is, just so there's no confusion on these points. I believe that we should repeal Obamacare, including the taxes, and provide for a stable transition period. I believe that the work to replace Obamacare should also begin immediately, meaning that our repeal bill should include as many Obamacare replacement policies as procedures allow. A more complete replacement can and should be crafted in the coming months as we work through some of the more complicated issues. Now, that has been my position since roughly March of 2010, when the final pieces of Obamacare were signed into law. And I've repeated it in numerous times over the years. Moreover, I believe that most Republicans in Congress share that same view. Do some Republicans have different views regarding the proper order and procedure for this endeavor? I'm sure they do, but I don't know of a single Republican who does not want to get rid of Obamacare. I certainly don't know any Republicans who are fine with the status quo in our health care system. That being the case, no one should be trying to parse anyone's words or split hairs in order to manufacture divisions in the Republican ranks on repealing and replacing Obamacare. I have little doubt that we can work through whatever differences do exist, and more importantly, I think we will. I'm not going to speculate today on the floor about what the final process or product will look like, but I will say that at the end of the day, only three numbers matter: 218, 51, and 1. Those are the numbers of supporters we need at each step to pass an Obamacare repeal and replacement. At this point, given what we currently know, I strongly believe that the process I described earlier, a full repeal and a responsible transition coupled with a sizable down payment on replacement, followed by a committed effort to implement additional replacement policies in the coming months, provides the best path forward to achieving those thresholds. And like I said, most Republicans in Congress agree with me. We can discuss other ideas, and I'm happy to engage in that discussion. But those numbers, 218, 51, and 1, have to be the standard by which we judge any alternatives. And while I'd love to see the final product passed with even larger numbers, and even with some Democrats on board with us, those numbers give us a clear picture as to how much consensus is necessary. Once again, I think we can get there. And I'm continually working with colleagues in both the House and Senate to make sure we do. With that, Mr. President, I yield the floor.
President.
The senator from New Hampshire.
Mr. President, I come to the floor this afternoon to oppose the nomination of Betsy DeVos, President Trump's choice to be Secretary of Education. And I fundamentally disagree with my colleague from Texas who said earlier that this is a fight about power and who maintains power, whether it's going to stay in Washington or whether it's going to be in the state and local communities. In New Hampshire, we believe in local control of education. It's a bedrock of our public education system. And this fight is not about power in Washington versus power in the states. This is a fight about, are we going to continue to support our public school system, our system of public higher education? Or are we going to take the money out, the support out, the policies out, and put that into private schools, into religious schools, and gut the public education system in this country? You know, my parents were part of the greatest generation. I grew up in post-World War II America. They understood that the best way for me to have opportunities for the future, my sisters and me, was to make sure that we had a good education. And I benefited by going to great public schools in the state of Missouri, in the state of Pennsylvania, and I was also able to go to public higher education. Without the ability to attend a public university in Pennsylvania and then in West Virginia and in the state of Mississippi, I would not have been able to get a college education because my parents wouldn't have been able to afford to send me to a private school, just like they wouldn't have been able to afford to send me to private K through 12 schools. I'm proud of the schools that I attended and proud of the support that my parents and so many other parents gave to public schools in America. My children and grandchildren have benefited from the great public schools in New Hampshire. And as governor, I was proud to work with the Republican legislature to improve the schools in the state of New Hampshire. We expanded public kindergarten in our state because at the time I became governor, we didn't have public kindergarten for all students, and we were able to open the door for an additional 25,000 kids to go to public kindergarten. We were able to increase funding for schools in New Hampshire during my time as governor. And I learned during those experiences, and also as a teacher, I taught in public schools in New Hampshire, in Dover, and also in Mississippi. I learned the connection between public education and good schools and our economy. Now, I taught in Mississippi in 1970. At that time, there was no public education in Mississippi that was a requirement for all students. So if you didn't want to go to school in the 70s in Mississippi, you didn't have to. And we saw the impact that that had on economic indicators in the state of Mississippi. Now, since then, they have adopted compulsory education for students in Mississippi. But it was a great lesson to me to see how important good schools are and a good education is to making sure we have a strong economy in this country. And if I talk, as governor, when I talked to businesses in the state of New Hampshire, one of the things they told me that they needed in order for their businesses to succeed was a skilled workforce, young people who had a good education, who could learn the skills on the job, and they looked for communities to locate in where there was a strong system of public education in those communities. I value public schools as one of our nation's bedrock civic and democratic institutions because they provide the best opportunity for kids from all walks of life to get a quality education, and they pass on to each new generation, including the children of immigrants, America's shared ideals and values. Regrettably, after careful study of Mrs. DeVos' record as an activist, I have concluded that she doesn't agree with this view of our public schools. She has no relevant experience as a teacher, as a leader in public schools. She has never attended a public school, and she's not sent any of her children to a public school. To the contrary, she has spent her entire career and countless millions of dollars of her personal fortune working not to improve public schools, but to privatize them, to weaken them by diverting public funds to private and religious schools. And given her past record, it makes no sense to put Ms. DeVos in charge of the Department of Education unless the aim is to devalue, defund, and perhaps eventually destroy our public schools. And I think that's unacceptable. In my state of New Hampshire, support for our public schools is bipartisan and it's passionate. In rural communities, in small towns, and our cities across the state, our public schools are institutions that have support from communities. They're a big part of our communities' identities and shared experiences. And across centuries and generations in the Granite State, public schools have been at the heart of our common civic life. So I think it's not surprising that my office has been inundated with letters, with emails, with phone calls, strongly opposing the DeVos nomination. My office has received more than 4,000 letters and emails from Granite Staters Now, that may not seem like a lot to somebody from the state of California, but from the state of New Hampshire to have 4,000 letters and emails on a nomination is unheard of. And almost all of them oppose this nomination. In addition, we've received 1,405 telephone calls in opposition and only 3 in support. 3. 1, 2, 3. 1,405 opposed and 3 in support. I'm impressed not only by the volume of constituent messages, but by the intensity of their opposition. Megan is a social studies teacher. She writes, and I quote, "Mrs. DeVos clearly lacks even a basic understanding of federal education policy, laws, and instructional practices. She has no relevant experience. There is just no way I would ever be certified to instruct students in New Hampshire if I lacked as much knowledge and experience in my field. But she gets to be the nation's chief educator? How is this good for kids?" End quote. Roger is a retired public school teacher from Concord, and he writes, quote, "Please reject DeVos because she's anti-public education in word and in practice, lacking the understanding of the public education system and having no understanding of the dreamers sitting in public schools this morning, creating their own American dreams, learning of the promise and justice that is America." End quote. And Sam from the Seacoast writes, "It's important that we maintain a strong public school system. This is not a partisan issue. Any person, regardless of party, can see that Ms. DeVos is unqualified to fill the position. You need to vote no to save our education system." And Mike from Durham writes, "I'm really concerned that we might have someone with so little experience in education and with seemingly anti-public education views as our next education leader. I fear that a DeVos confirmation will only exacerbate the already segregated school experiences that children have in our country. I want all students to have a fair shake at a high-quality school experience, not just ones who live in wealthy communities or who have parents savvy enough to advocate on their behalf." End quote. Now, many of the letters that I've received are from parents who are outraged about Ms. DeVos' comments on the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, which is one of the landmark civil rights laws of the 20th century. In response to a question from my colleague, Senator Hassan, Ms. DeVos made it clear that she was unaware that that law was a federal law and that it governs our schools. IDEA ensures that children with disabilities have the opportunity to receive a free, appropriate public education, and that they are accommodated in our schools and classrooms just like all other children. In her testimony, Ms. DeVos said that decisions about how to treat students with disabilities should be left to the states. Can you imagine what would happen in states who decide they don't want to make sure that those students can go to schools? I received this message from Marilyn, who lives in the western part of New Hampshire. She says, "Thank you for opposing the confirmation of Betsy DeVos as Education Secretary. She is a dangerous, unqualified choice. As the parent of a daughter with Down syndrome, I fear for the future of IDEA if DeVos is in charge." And Ashley Preston, who was Teacher of the Year in New Hampshire in 2016, wrote this to me: "If our Secretary of Education does not understand and value the importance of federal laws such as IDEA, how can we expect states and local school districts to do that? These are the elements crucial to ensuring the best chance for our future." Well, the Department of Education has oversight not only of K through 12 public schools, but also higher education, including a portfolio of more than $1.2 trillion in federal student loans. I've had the opportunity not only to teach in our K through 12 schools, but to work in public universities in New Hampshire and in private universities. Listening to Ms. DeVos' testimony I was appalled by her lack of understanding of higher education policy. She acknowledged that neither she nor her children had ever received a federal loan or a Pell Grant. And this is the worst part, when asked to commit to enforcing rules that ensure students aren't cheated and end up with no degree but a mountain of student debt, in other words, the predicament of students who went to Trump University and so many other private for-profit colleges, she refused to do that. She refused to say this is something that we should support as a policy in America. I'm also deeply concerned by her support for charter schools that are not accountable and her reputation as, quote, the four-star general of the voucher movement. Now, I believe there's a role for charter schools. I think as we try to improve our public system of higher education, we need to look at a number of models. I voted for New Hampshire's charter school law. But we should hold them accountable, just like we hold our public schools accountable. We should ensure that they don't drain resources from public schools. There was a report that came out in 2012 or 2013 that was done by a working group under the auspices of the Annenberg Institute for Social Reform. And one of the things they discovered in their report were some similar challenges across charter schools. They found that there was uneven academic performance, that some of them had overly harsh discipline practices, that funding sometimes destabilized traditional schools, that there was a lack of transparency and oversight that led to conflicts of interest and, in some cases, fraud, and that many of them practiced policies that kept students out for various reasons. Now, Ms. DeVos was one of the architects of Michigan's first charter school law in 1993. It's been widely criticized for lacking accountability and safeguards for students. In her confirmation hearing, Ms. DeVos refused to agree that for-profit charter schools should be held to the same standards as public schools. And just as disturbing is her support for school vouchers, which would siphon funding from public schools and divert it to private and religious schools. Advocates of vouchers like to call it school choice. But in practice, parents have learned that choice is not a reality. Florida, under Governor Jeb Bush, was the first state to enact a statewide voucher system. And nearly 93% of private and parochial schools in Florida, after that law, refused to accept any voucher students. In New Hampshire, we have parts of the state where if we don't have public schools, there are no other choices for our students. I don't care whether you've got a voucher or not. You can't drive 3 or 4 hours to get to the next public school or the next private school. So let's be clear. Vouchers and other privatization schemes advocated by Ms. DeVos, they're not about pedagogy. They're about ideology. They are all about disdain for what many voucher advocates like to call government schools. Well, government schools are public schools. They're schools that our communities have for their kids. And what Ms. DeVos fails to understand is that quality education has nothing to do with whether a school is public or private. We have public schools in New Hampshire that we need to work on. But what counts are high-quality teachers, it's support from parents and communities, it's facilities where kids can enjoy learning and be safe, it's rigorous academic standards, and it's the resources to make sure that children can get the learning that they need, including individualized assistance to kids with special needs. What counts is the political and budgetary commitment to create high-quality schools in every neighborhood, regardless of zip code. Because Betsy DeVos doesn't understand these basic truths about education in America, because she's driven by an ideological hostility to our public schools, she is the wrong person to serve as our Secretary of Education. I intend to vote no on the nomination of Ms. DeVos, and I urge my colleagues on both sides of the aisle to join me in rejecting this unqualified nominee. Thank you, Mr. President. I yield the floor.
Mr. President.
The senator from Michigan.
Mr. President, I rise today to speak in opposition to the nomination of Betsy DeVos for Secretary of Education. My reason is very simple. Mrs. DeVos lacks the experience required to oversee the Department of Education, an agency that serves over 50 million public school children across America. Despite spending many years giving hundreds of millions of dollars to backing political candidates and ballot initiatives that support unproven education policies, she remains shockingly unfamiliar with federal law and even some very basic education concepts. Educating our children is an incredibly important job, and we need someone who is experienced, prepared, and well qualified to lead the Department of Education. As I've said before, Mrs. DeVos has no experience in public education at any level, not as a teacher, not as an administrator, not as a student, not as a parent, not as a school board member, and not even as a borrower of public loans for college. Ask any parent. Our children are what we hold most dear. And it only makes sense that the individual that we entrust with our children's education should have at least some experience in public education. Mrs. DeVos has absolutely no experience, and I repeat, no tangible experience with neighborhood public schools. In fact, her only experience in education is her work lobbying for the transfer of taxpayer money to private schools. She has also pushed for the rapid expansion of charter schools without sufficient accountability to parents and to students. Which brings me to her track record in my home state of Michigan. Mrs. DeVos has pushed for school vouchers to send our public tax dollars to private schools. Her staunch advocacy for the use of taxpayer funding for private and charter school systems earned her the nickname as the four-star general of the pro-voucher movement. The vast majority of children in Michigan and in the United States attend neighborhood public schools. Voucher programs rob these children of the resources that they need to receive high-quality education near where they live. Michigan voters soundly rejected her plan, and we cannot, and I repeat, we cannot put her in a position to push for voucher programs on a national scale that will weaken our neighborhood schools and will weaken, in particular, our rural schools. Now, let me be clear. I support innovative models for improving our education system, but only when those models are proven to work. For example, I have worked hard to ensure that all children have access to the skills and education that are vital to joining the modern workforce and competing in today's global economy. I introduced legislation that will reduce the price tag for higher learning by allowing students to complete college-level courses while they're still in public high school. The Making Education Affordable and Accessible Act will help students save time and money as they kickstart their careers through a very personalized curriculum. Whether an early middle college program or dual and concurrent enrollment program, these models help traditional public school students save money and get ahead by earning college credit while they finish their high school education. These programs are typically run by a local school district or an intermediate school district and are offered at little or no cost to the student. They also help students identify their major or interest area sooner so that they can complete their college degree and graduate as much as 1 year earlier. Across the state of Michigan, students are participating in more than 90 early and middle college programs that are proven to significantly increase high school graduation rates. Jobs for the Future found that nationally 90% of early college students graduate high school versus 78% nationally. This is just one example of the kind of innovative approach with proven results that policymakers should support to improve education outcomes. Education reform must be driven by data and validated outcomes and not by political ideology. Our primary focus must always be on increasing opportunities for the millions of students in our neighborhood public schools. And given Mrs. DeVos's history of supporting policies that undermine traditional public schools and the communities that they serve, I do not think she would act in the best interest of American students. Mr. President, Michigan has been devoted to great public education for generations, a commitment that stretches back to even before the founding of our state. Some of our state's earliest pioneers, including my ancestors, settled under the guidance of the Northwest Ordinance, which stated, and I quote, "Schools and the means of education shall forever be encouraged." Our nation has strived to live up to this creed ever since, honoring the fundamental truth that all of our children have the right to an education, no matter who they are, where they live, how much money their parents have, or how they learn. Government at all levels, state, local, and federal, share the responsibility of ensuring that our children have access to quality education. In addition to providing significant federal dollars to local school districts, the federal government plays a critical role in preventing discrimination and creating opportunity. Federal education laws play a vital role ensuring that all students have equal access to learning opportunities. Laws like the landmark 1975 Individuals with Disabilities Act, or IDEA. Before the enactment of IDEA, too many of our children with disabilities were denied the chance to learn from our broader community. And likewise, our broader communities were denied the chance to learn from these youth and the extraordinary perspectives and contributions that they offer to American society. Now, thanks to IDEA, 6.5 million of our children, or 13% of all public school students, are not condemned to a life of isolation or mere accommodation. Instead, federal law ensures every child has access to the resources that he or she needs to become productive and included members of our increasingly diverse 21st century. IDEA assists public schools with offering high-quality special education and early intervention services for children with disabilities from birth to age 21. As a result of IDEA is responsible for millions of youth with disabilities graduating from high school, enrolling in college, and finding jobs as valuable participants in the American economy. But IDEA will not enforce itself. It is the responsibility of the Department of Education and its leadership to monitor, evaluate, and provide technical assistance to states, making sure that our schools are offering learning opportunities that meet every student's needs. It is the responsibility of the Senate to determine whether or not Mrs. DeVos can carry out this task and live up to the creed of forever encouraging education. Unfortunately, Mrs. DeVos has demonstrated little comprehension of the federal role in protecting students with disabilities' equal right to an education. This became evident when she was asked directly about IDEA during her confirmation hearing, and Mrs. DeVos tried to excuse her erroneous answer by saying, and I quote, "I may have confused it." Now, every student knows the importance of doing their homework, studying for their exams, and practicing for any class presentations in advance. Every educator knows that the answer, "I may have confused it," is not a response that leads to a passing grade. With the stakes as high as they are, it is clear that Mrs. DeVos did not do her homework. She did not study for her potential role. She did not practice for her interview with the Senate committee, and most importantly, the American people. Now, she has contributed millions of dollars to Republican politicians over the years and probably thought that was the only qualification that she needs. We need to prove the American people that she is wrong. I take the responsibility under the United States Constitution to provide advice and consent to the President very seriously. And I know my colleagues here in the Senate do so as well. But given Mrs. DeVos's weak performance in her interview before the American people and her inability to demonstrate a basic understanding of key education concepts, I do not think that we can give her a passing grade. As senators, we do not operate under a model of social promotion under which we pass an unqualified individual to a higher office simply because they showed up. Perhaps this is why Mrs. DeVos's nomination is expected to see the most bipartisan opposition to her confirmation of all of the president's nominations to date. Mr. President, Mrs. DeVos's response regarding IDEA during her confirmation hearing was not the only response that I found alarming. As the father of 2 college-age daughters, I'm extremely concerned about ensuring that our college campuses provide safe environments where students can learn and grow. And I was shocked by a recent comprehensive report done by one school that found over 20% of female undergraduates experienced unwanted sexual contact. Sadly, this problem is not confined to one school. It is a public safety and health crisis that we must immediately take action on. The Department of Education has taken important first steps to combat the prevalence of campus sexual assault by opening investigations in over 200 schools and publishing guidance to ensure that universities are affording students Title IX protections, the freedom from discrimination on the basis of sex, and freedom from sexual violence. Mrs. DeVos apparently has a different reaction to the threats many young students face while pursuing their higher education. As we saw during her confirmation hearing, she said it is, quote, premature for her to say if she will choose to uphold the Department of Education's guidance on preventing sexual violence. This is completely unacceptable to me as a senator representing over 500,000 undergraduate students attending one of Michigan's outstanding colleges and universities, and this is completely unacceptable to me as a father. It is also unacceptable in the eyes of over 1,000 graduates of the same school in Michigan that Mrs. DeVos attended herself, Calvin College. Calvin College alumni from the class of 1947 to the class of 2020 sent my office an extensive petition expressing their deep concern with Mrs. DeVos's nomination. In their letter, these alumni presented several reasons they oppose Mrs. DeVos's confirmation. Specifically, they expressed concerns that she does not understand or support the many federal policies like IDEA and Title IX that she would be required to enforce. They wrote, and I quote, "This is especially concerning given that the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act and Title IX, which ensure that all students' educational experiences are free of discrimination that impede learning, are not a value to Mrs. DeVos." End of quote. I could not agree more with her fellow alumni. My office has received over 8,000 calls in opposition to the nomination of Betsy DeVos, and I'm sure my colleagues have heard from thousands and thousands of their own constituents all across this country. The American people are making their voices heard, and they are telling the United States Senate that Mrs. DeVos is not the right choice to lead the Department of Education. I urge my colleagues to listen to their constituents who are forcefully rejecting Mrs. DeVos's misguided vision for neighborhood public schools in America. I will be standing with the people of Michigan and once again call on my colleagues to join the bipartisan opposition to Mrs. DeVos's nomination. Our children's future depends on it, and for their sake, please vote no. Mr. President, I yield the floor.
Mr. President.
Senator from Oklahoma.
Mr. President, I believe that Betsy DeVos is going to make an excellent Secretary of Education. Let me share. Well, first of all, Mr. President, I ask unanimous consent that my defense fellow, Captain James Hart, be granted floor privileges for the remainder of this calendar year.
Without objection.
And Mr. President, I've been fortunate enough to get to know Jeff Sessions for the last 20 years. Not only is he a colleague that I admire and respect, but he is also one of my very best friends. I actually suffered through with him back when he had a nomination that was rejected by this body many years ago. As you know, Senator Sessions has been nominated by the President to be the next Attorney General of the United States, and it's an incredible honor. There's no doubt in my mind that my friend will be perfect for the job. He's more than qualified for this position, and I know he'll keep his word when he says he plans to uphold the laws that we pass in Congress. Senator Sessions was elected to the United States Senate in 1997. That was 2 years after I was elected, and we've been very close friends ever since. 20 years now, we've known each other and worked alongside with both the Senate Armed Services Committee and the Environment and Public Works Committee. Those are the two major committees that we've been on, Mr. President, and he is seated just to my right at each one of the committees. And as the chair knows, you get to know a person pretty well when you've been sitting there these 3 or 4 hour-long meetings. And so we've had that relationship with each other. Not only have we worked together, but we've also traveled and prayed together. You know, you really get to know someone when you work, travel, and pray together. When working, a person's mind is revealed. When traveling, a person's character is revealed. And when praying, a person's heart is revealed. And I've come to know Senator Sessions as a God-fearing family man who puts others before himself and has a deep respect for the rule of law. Family man, every time he has a grandchild, his wife and my wife talk about our competing grandchildren. He helps those in need and makes sure that the legal system is protecting our citizens and holding criminals accountable. A person also only needs to look at the legislation and causes that he's championed to know him. He played a key role in fighting for fairness and funding for the rural HIV/AIDS patients when negotiating the reauthorization of the bipartisan Ryan White CARE Act. His advocacy brought funding to low-income, mostly African-American women who did not have easily accessible health care before. Senator Sessions has been an author and supporter of many pieces of bipartisan legislation, including protecting victims of child abuse, reducing prison sentences for those who were unfairly targeted, and helping the families of our fallen military personnel. As a member of the Senate Armed Services Committee, Senator Sessions has become a fierce advocate for keeping our country safe from terrorism, and he understands the risks that we face. In fact, Senator Sessions is tough on crime and is well suited to oversee federal law enforcement activities and assist local governments in their efforts. Violent crime has recently been increasing. Furthermore, and I just found this out, Mr. President, that the shooting deaths of police officers has increased by 68% just last year between 2015 and 2016. That's pretty remarkable. And these trends are unacceptable, and Senator Sessions has pledged to reverse the course by strengthening the partnership between federal and local law enforcement and going after drug traffickers, aliens who violate the laws, and criminals who use guns to commit crimes. There's no question that Senator Sessions is qualified to do what he says he will and what the job asks of him. He has served as a United States attorney in Alabama in the Southern District, and he was also Alabama's Attorney General. So he clearly knows the job. He didn't have to be training. And it is because of his previous experiences that he will be able to transition from a partisan legislator to our nation's top law enforcement officer with great ease. Countless groups of people have come out and support the nominee: the Fraternal Order of Police, the National Sheriff's Association, former U.S. attorneys, a former FBI director, current state attorneys general, and many more. All the law enforcement people are behind him, and there's a reason for it, because that's his record, and people are aware of it. So I'd like to take a minute to point out that it's crucial and cruel and unfair that people have tried to paint a picture of Senator Sessions as someone and something that he is not. I hate that this is something that needs to be said. The man the opposition has painted does not exist. You all know Jeff Sessions. You know that the awful things being said about him are completely false. In fact, back in 1981, the Ku Klux Klan ordered the tragic, extremely undeserved murder of a young African-American by the name of Michael Donald. Because of Senator Sessions' help and support, these Klan members were convicted and given their either life sentences or the death penalty, and that's Jeff Sessions. Furthermore, he later played a major role in the destruction of the Ku Klux Klan in Alabama when he helped bring a civil suit against them. As a result, the KKK went bankrupt and caused them to fall apart in that region. Again, that's Jeff Sessions' efforts. And before we vote on the confirmation of our friend and colleague, I ask that you all take a moment and seriously reflect how Senator Sessions has worked diligently with you over the past 2 decades and how perfectly qualified he is for this position. Now, as for me, I thank him for his tireless efforts in Congress, for his friendship and his fellowship. He'll go down as one of the truly great U.S. Attorney Generals in this country's history. And Mr. President, there are a lot of other nominees, and I've gotten to know. I had an experience of going actually to Trump Tower and getting to know some of the people who advise him. And as I looked around the table, and I saw people that were the right kind of people in healthcare, the right kind of people in energy, the right kind of people in military to give him advice in areas that he might not have been exposed to in the past. And I just noticed that it's been very slow. I was not aware of this until just a few minutes ago, that apparently the cabinet confirmations are the slowest since George Washington. And this is something it's really wrong, and it's, you can criticize someone, but after a while, you just go ahead and you know that the votes are there, and you make sure that we go ahead and do it. Well, I would say this to the presiding officer, since he and I are both from Oklahoma, which is in the 10th Circuit, that last week, President Trump announced that he is nominating Judge Neil Gorsuch of the 10th Circuit Court of Appeals to be the United States Supreme Court Justice. And as someone who has been following the news and rumors on who the pick will be, I've been looking into potential nominees for weeks, and I was pleased to see Judge Gorsuch when his name came up, because we know something about him. After the untimely death of Justice Scalia a year ago, it was clear that the presidential election would be about the direction of the Supreme Court for the next generation, or maybe even generations. With the results of the election, a Republican president and Republican Congress, the American people have entrusted us with confirming a justice that will adhere to the rule of law and will not try to read between the lines when interpreting legislation or the Constitution. With the selection of Judge Gorsuch, I believe President Trump has picked just such a justice. The president might not know or remember, but George W. Bush nominated Judge Gorsuch to his current position, and the Senate confirmed him unanimously by voice vote. We went back and looked at the record. No one had voted against him. The same guy that is up before us today, at this time. There's no question that Judge Gorsuch is qualified for the Supreme Court. He is a graduate of Columbia University, Harvard Law School, and of Oxford. He clerked for Judge Centelli of the U.S. Court of Appeals for the D.C. Circuit. He clerked for Supreme Court Justices Byron White and Anthony Kennedy. So he knows the job. It is no on-the-job training for him. He has been in private practice. He's been principal deputy to the Associate Attorney General and the acting Associate Attorney General at the U.S. Department of Justice. Much like the justice he is nominated to replace, Judge Gorsuch has become known for his writing style. One of his former law clerks said that his, quote, favorite aspect of the judge's writing is his ability to humanize disputes. It appears that Gorsuch has more in common with the late Justice Scalia than just writing abilities. He has said that, and this is the quote, assiduous focus on text, structure, and history is essential to the proper exercise of judicial function. That judicial philosophy has been borne out in his record on the 10th Circuit. My home state of Oklahoma is within the 10th Circuit jurisdiction, so we know him very well. Oklahoma is the home of Hobby Lobby. Everyone's familiar with what Hobby Lobby is, and it started out, a lot of people don't realize this, but it started out when I was in the state legislature. The Greens, who have Hobby Lobby, started out in their garage, and they were putting together at that time things that they could frames for miniature picture frames and that type of thing. And with a loan of $600, David and Barbara Green began making miniature picture frames. Now today, Hobby Lobby is the largest privately owned arts and crafts store in the world, with over 700 stores in every state except 3. The Greens are people of faith, and when they were facing fines under the Obamacare for not providing certain insurance coverage that violated their faith, they were faced with an impossible choice, and they took it to court, risking millions of personal dollars in doing so. In siding with Hobby Lobby against the Obamacare contraceptive mandate, Judge Gorsuch stressed the point that it is not for a court to decide whether the owner's religious convictions are correct or consistent, but instead the court's role is only to protect the exercise of faith. And the Supreme Court agreed. Again, Judge Gorsuch defended the Little Sisters of the Poor's religious beliefs in his dissent of the 10th Circuit refusal to rehear their case against the Obama administration regarding the same mandate Hobby Lobby was contesting. Time and again, Judge Gorsuch has defended religious expressions in public space. In addition to defending the First Amendment protection regarding the free exercise of religion, he is also skeptical of the idea that agencies should be given wide latitude when interpreting statutory language. In a recent opinion, Judge Gorsuch suggested that the precedent of the judiciary to give deference to agencies on statutory interpretations limits the courts when reviewing the legality of agency actions. Gorsuch believes it is for Congress to write the laws, to the executive to carry them out, and the judiciary to interpret them, just as our founding fathers had planned. I look forward to working to move Judge Gorsuch's nomination forward. He's going to be confirmed, and he'll make a great justice of the United States Supreme Court. With that, Mr. President, I yield the floor.
Mr. President.
Senator from Michigan.
Before my colleague and friend from Oklahoma leaves the floor, while we disagree on the current debates in terms of voting, I just have to say, when I see him, I constantly thank him for his efforts last year as he worked with us for the community of Flint. And we're finally seeing some hope in terms of replacing and addressing lead contamination. And without the distinguished senator from Oklahoma, that literally would not have happened. And so we have things we disagree on and agree on, and on this one coming together with the families of Flint and particularly the children and the long-term impacts, you will always have a warm space in the hearts of all of us who care deeply about that issue. Thank you very much. Mr. President, I want to speak today about the nomination in front of us, Betsy DeVos. You know, Betsy DeVos's nomination is very personal to many people who live in Michigan, because Betsy DeVos is from Michigan. And her vision of education and her actions have unfortunately played a major role in undermining our public schools. Families all across our state can tell the story of her work with Michigan schools firsthand because they've seen it firsthand. They've lived it firsthand. And they all say the same thing. Democrats, Republicans, independents, people who live in cities that are big and small cities, and parents and teachers and principals and community leaders from across the state, overwhelmingly they've told me that Betsy DeVos should not be our next Secretary of Education. I can't believe everywhere that I go how people will stop me about this and how strongly people feel in Michigan about this. They're saying this because, among other things, she's pushed for policies that have made charter schools in Michigan less accountable and taken dollars away from public schools, where the vast majority of children get their education, in the process of that. Policies that have hurt our children and put their futures at risk. I've gotten so many emails and phone calls and people involved in every which way, at the grocery store, out in public events, people coming up to me. I just want to share a couple of emails. Chris, who's a teacher from Harper Woods, who worked as a teacher in the Detroit public schools for over 20 years, wrote and said to me, Betsy DeVos believes in school privatization and vouchers. She's worked to undermine efforts to regulate Michigan charters, even when they clearly fail. The marketplace solution of DeVos's will destroy our democratically governed community schools. Her hostility towards public education disqualifies her. Those are Chris's comments. In Michigan last year, state legislators put together a bipartisan plan, and our state legislature, House and Senate, is majority Republicans, and they put together a bipartisan plan to increase both funding and accountability for Detroit public schools. Mr. President, there's a lot of wonderful things happening in Detroit around businesses coming back to Detroit and economic development, but we have major work to do for our children in the schools. And so there was a huge effort that came together, bipartisan, to increase funding and accountability for the public schools, including charter schools. And it was common sense proposal. Betsy DeVos led the effort to stop it, particularly the part that brought critically needed public accountability for-profit and nonprofit charter schools. Unfortunately, right now in Michigan, we have a system where anyone can apply to open a charter school. There are no statewide standards for revoking a charter, and taxpayer money is sent to them with virtually no public disclosure requirements. And for example, we have for-profit charter management companies that say they are private businesses, and therefore, even though they're getting public money, they say they are private businesses and they should not have to comply with a series of disclosure requirements regarding teachers and other information that, frankly, parents would want to know, and taxpayers have a right to know. 38% of charters in Michigan are at the bottom of the 25% of schools in our state. So when you look at the bottom fourth, 38% of the charters are in that category, and there is unfortunately very little accountability for their performance. And sadly, precious taxpayer dollars have been taken away from public schools, neighborhood schools, to fund these charters. And when it comes to funding for public schools, she won't commit to protecting the critical federal dollars that serve our children. One mom, Hillary Young, from Detroit, came to Washington to watch the confirmation hearing on Betsy DeVos in the Help Committee. She wrote to me, she said she was not impressed and told a group of parents afterwards, as a parent, I can't stand silently and watch other children be subject to similar circumstances to my child in Detroit. My sixth grader was without a math teacher for over half the year last year because of funding reductions. The effect of DeVos policies is not parents voting with their feet to go to better schools, it's children bearing the burden for fixing the education system they're supposed to be served by. And she goes on to say, DeVos's ideal free market school choice system has left our city's education landscape in chaos, leaving less choice, less quality, and even more government bureaucracy. We've seen parents get involved and speak out all across Michigan and frankly all across the country. I've gotten more mail, more emails, more phone calls on this nominee than any other, and I've gotten a lot on a lot of nominees. But there is a broad outcry. People like Kathleen, who's a farmer and a grandmother from Farmington Hills, who wrote to me, "We have 15 grandchildren who are in the public school system, and we are terrified that there will be no more public schools and that the quality will be far inferior to charter and other private schools. I'm writing you to respectfully ask that you do not vote to confirm Betsy DeVos as Secretary of Education." And I'm deeply concerned about what we heard in committee about her views on special education. In the HELP hearing last week, she suggested that states should decide on whether or not to enforce IDEA, the Individuals with Disabilities Act, that has been such a landmark, opening doors of schools in every neighborhood across our country for children with disabilities. This law was enacted in 1975 and makes sure that children with disabilities have the same educational opportunities as other children. My nephew Barry, who has now gone through the special education system in Michigan, is a wonderful young man with Down syndrome, and I've seen personally how important that was for him to be able to go on now and be successful in the community, as a part of the community. And it is a very important civil right, frankly, for children with disabilities, as well as an essential part of our educational system. Now, Betsy DeVos, after her hearing, followed up when she was asked about special education. She followed up with a letter days later and wrote about, quote, expanding the conversation about school choice opportunities for parents of children with disabilities. But she didn't say anything about helping those in traditional public schools or helping students in the schools that they are now. Mr. President, for me, this is not about politics or partisan messaging, or even charters or private schools versus traditional public schools. It really is about what's best for our children and for our country. Families in Michigan and all across the country know this. Tens of thousands of people have called me over the last few weeks and sent emails and letters. Who we choose to be the Secretary of Education doesn't just affect the over 50 million children who attend public elementary and secondary schools. It affects the future of our country. And it's a fundamental difference in views. A competitive free market system with winners and losers works in the private marketplace. I support that. Businesses open, they compete, they don't do well, they close, or they do very well, and they go on and they grow. That's a strength in our country. But it doesn't work for educating our children because we can't afford losers. We can't afford losers when it comes to something as basic as fundamental education and creating opportunity for our children in the future. We need to provide every opportunity for every child to work hard and succeed. You know, I support having choices. I support magnet schools and public charters. I did that as a state senator. Other choices that are great opportunities for children. If there are equal standards and public accountability for taxpayers' dollars, and parents can have confidence in that accountability. And if it's part of the public school system, the public process, and only if they are in addition to quality neighborhood schools in every neighborhood, in every zip code. It's not just a slogan to say it shouldn't matter where you live, what kind of opportunity you get, or your child has. And that is becoming more and more true. It certainly is in Michigan, where this philosophy has been a test case, and we are seeing it across the country. We can't afford losers. A winners and losers system is not good enough for our kids. Betsy DeVos has a record of working against the vision of accountability and standards and choice within a system where every child has a quality neighborhood school in their neighborhood, in every zip code. She has worked against that vision. She doesn't believe in that. We have fundamental differences in what will help our children for the future. And that's why I will be voting no on her confirmation. Thank you.
Mr. President.
Senator from Virginia.
Mr. President, first of all, I want to thank my friend, the senator from Michigan, for her comments and views on this nominee. I rise today to add my voice to those expressing concern about the nomination of Betsy DeVos to serve as U.S. Secretary of Education. The chorus of concern is not only comes from those colleagues who have already come to the floor last week or earlier today or throughout, I know, the evening and into tomorrow morning, but it also comes from literally tens of thousands of my constituents who have contacted me about Ms. DeVos. I've been flooded with phone calls, emails, and social media messages from Virginians all across the Commonwealth. In many ways, at numbers that I haven't seen since the debate about the ACA. These Virginians worry about Ms. DeVos's confirmation. They worry that what it would mean for our children, our students, and for progress towards proving and providing every child with a quality public education, regardless of their zip code. Like many of my colleagues, I bring to the debate some direct experience as both as a state or local elected official. I had the great honor of serving as governor of Virginia. I was responsible in that job for how we were preparing our students for success in college and the workforce. I took this responsibility very, very personally. As somebody who attended good public schools all his life, somebody who was lucky enough to be the first in my family to graduate from college, I realized that I wouldn't have been able to have been governor, or for that matter, obviously senator, without that foundation I received in my education. Those public schools, and I had the opportunity to go to public schools in 3 different states growing up. Many of those public school teachers were the folks who framed my views about government, about our system, about how you actually get through in life. And I believe in many ways public schools and the whole notion of public education really forms the cornerstone of what is the social contract in America. That getting that basic public education was a right of all individuals. And when I think back on everything that I was able to accomplish as Virginia's governor, the validation I valued the most that was when I left the governor's office in 2006. Virginia was consistently recognized by independent validators as the nation's best state for a lifetime of educational opportunity from pre-K to college and beyond. So as someone who is committed to reforming and looking at how we can make sure our public education can work for all, as someone who spent a career before in business and tried working in a philanthropic sense on how we could expand educational opportunities, I believe that I bring some experiences on this debate. And that's why, Mr. President, I stand here today unable to support the nomination of Betsy DeVos to serve as Secretary of Education. To put it simply, Ms. DeVos's single-minded focus on charter schools and on vouchers, on converting federal education dollars into a different program, is simply out of step with the education climate in the Commonwealth of Virginia. Now, let me make clear, I have supported public charter schools. I believe they are a tool that ought to be in the toolkit. I've taken on those forces who stand for simply no reform in education. But I'm unconvinced that Ms. DeVos's complete setting of different priorities at the federal level is in the best interest of our students, our teachers, or our public schools. And that's exactly what I've been hearing from constituents all over the state. I'd like to very briefly share some of those concerns that I've heard. Laura, from my hometown of Alexandria, writes this, well, quote, "While many of our president's cabinet picks worry me, none worry me more than Betsy DeVos for Secretary of Education." She says she comes from rural Appalachia, where she said she worked her way through public schools in one of the poorest counties in the country. But that didn't stop her from ending up here in Northern Virginia, working for the intelligence community. In areas like my hometown, where public schools are the only option, they become the lifeblood of the community. On limited resources, our high school had to get creative about how to provide for the students, often partnering with the local university. But shutting the school down in favor of charters or adding a for-profit alternative definitely wasn't an option in her low-income area. Another view, a school administrator from the Shenandoah Valley, says this, quote, "After her confirmation hearing, it was quite clear she had no knowledge of instruction, curriculum, federal programs, and most disturbing, had no understanding of the federal laws that are in place to protect children with disabilities. Quote, "It is a serious business to educate children, and the consequences are huge if we do it wrong." Another comment, and again, these are just samples of thousands. Olivia, a teacher in Williamsburg, shared this, quote, "I see so much potential in my students every day, and I feel very energetic as a young teacher about the opportunities that I know our public schools are providing already and are capable of providing in the future." She said she was concerned for her LGBT students, for low-income students, and for the future of myself and my colleagues as public school educators trying to do good for our students. Mr. President, I have received thousands of similar heartfelt messages from every corner of Virginia. Now, I welcome this level of public attention and citizen engagement. And sometimes, as the President's nominees have come forward, I voted for many of them, much to the consternation of some folks. But it is my job to weigh, regardless of that public opinion, weigh what I think is best for students in Virginia, for that matter, students across the country. With this outpouring from teachers, parents, students, administrators, civil rights groups, charter school proponents and opponents from both sides of the political aisle, I believe it does weigh. And that's what I've done, listened to my constituents. But more importantly, I've listened to Ms. DeVos's own words before the Senate Help Committee. And let me tell you, I still have a lot of unresolved questions after reviewing Ms. DeVos's testimony. For starters, Ms. DeVos did not demonstrate that she understood the Individuals with Disability Education Act idea. She didn't understand that it was actually a federal law passed by Congress and signed by President George H.W. Bush. Contrary to the impression that Ms. DeVos seemed to have at her confirmation hearing, saying that somehow complying with IDEA was simply a voluntary measure. That is not right. It's not the law. And boy, oh boy, did that frighten a whole lot of parents whose kids have special needs, and without IDEA would not have those needs met. They're concerned that Ms. DeVos's seeming lack of familiarity with IDEA is indicative of how, if confirmed, her Department of Education would fail to protect the rights of these children and every child to a free and appropriate public education that allows even kids with special needs to flourish. Another area under the Department of Education's jurisdiction where I have concerns about Ms. DeVos's commitment and level of understanding is campus sexual assault compliance and enforcement. Since 2014, I've been proud to support bipartisan legislation led by my colleagues, Senator Gillibrand and Senator McCaskill, the Campus Accountability and Safety Act. At the end of last Congress, this legislation had the support of more than 1/3 of the United States Senate, as well as a broad coalition of advocacy groups law enforcement organizations, and many of our leading colleges and universities. The Department of Education's own Office of Civil Rights has also played a very important role in initiating and conducting Title IX investigations. So you can understand why many folks, including myself, were concerned when Ms. DeVos did not demonstrate any depth of knowledge about the difference of opinion surrounding particular policy issues related to campus sexual assault. Similarly, when asked a basic principle of education policy related to measuring students' achievement, Ms. DeVos was not able to articulate an understanding of the difference between growth and proficiency. In the same vein, and while this has become the subject of late-night comedy, I think it is a very serious matter. Ms. DeVos was not able to clearly express her understanding or her commitment to enforcing the Gun-Free School Zone Act, which, again, is federal legislation also signed by President Bush, where compliance is not an option. These are federal fundamental tenets of federal education policy, not some obscure metrics, not small bills that languished in committee or small compromises. These are the principles and cornerstones of federal education civil rights policy, and they could not be more central to the Secretary of Education's core responsibilities of safeguarding students and civil rights. For all those reasons and others, I'm not able to support Ms. DeVos's nomination to be Secretary of Education. I know, Mr. President, you've had to hear a number of these comments. I hope that if she is not confirmed, the President will send down an Education Secretary nominee that brings more mainstream views to this very important issue. Those of us, at least me, I'm all for education reform, but it's got to be led by someone who will always put the needs of our kids and making sure they all get a fair and appropriate education is guaranteed. With that, Mr. President, I yield the floor.
Mr. President.
Senator from New Mexico.
Mr. President, I am deeply disappointed by the qualification of President Trump's nominee to be the leader of our Department of Education. Betsy DeVos has clearly shown a disregard, even a hostility for the public school system. So I stand with the thousands of parents, teachers, and students of New Mexico in fighting to stop her confirmation. Simply put, education is too important to New Mexico's children, to our state's economy, to have a Secretary of Education not fully invested in the success of our public schools. As someone who grew up going to public school, who is sending my own kids to public schools, I am deeply troubled by Betsy DeVos's record on privatization, which goes well beyond simply voicing support for vouchers and private school. Ms. DeVos has been a key player in the well-moneyed effort to privatize and siphon funds away from public education, and she has time and again undermined the teachers that we all rely upon. It appears as though Betsy DeVos's most notable experience in education is spending her career and her fortune advocating for policies that divert public tax dollars away from public schools and into private schools. I cannot support a nominee who wants to weaken the kinds of public schools that so many New Mexicans rely on. The privatization policies pushed by Ms. DeVos would be especially damaging to rural New Mexico, where there are few options to begin with. It's not uncommon for students to travel more than an hour to get to and from school in those parts of the state. School administrators often wear multiple hats, sometimes running the after-school program or driving the local school bus. In rural areas in my home state, the public school is often the only choice, and there simply aren't enough students to support the kinds of for-profit private schools that Ms. DeVos wants to replace them with. Having a Secretary of Education who has spent her entire career pushing a privatization agenda is not reassuring to New Mexicans. and is at odds with the needs of the students and families across my state. Further, I do not believe that Ms. DeVos understands the federal government's trust responsibility in serving Native American students. Given Ms. DeVos's rushed nomination hearing in the Help Committee, senators were given very little opportunity to question her about her understanding of tribal issues and impact aid. So I'm concerned that she will push her privatization agenda in these areas as well. For example, Zuni Public School District is a small rural district in western New Mexico. Earlier this week, their school board sent me a letter asking that I oppose Ms. DeVos's nomination. I want to take a moment and I want to read a few passages from this letter. Quote, "The beauty of the United States public school system, unlike many in the rest of the world, is that we take everyone who walks through our doors and love every child who sits in our desks without question. This board, therefore, stands by all of our students, no matter what color or ethnicity, regardless of their creed, every child who identifies on the spectrum of LGBT or Q, every child with either a physical or learning disability, or both, every child who speaks a second language, every immigrant child, as well as every Native American child who can trace their lineage in this land back thousands of years, every child who sees their education as the bridge between their most ardent dreams and their most hopeful futures." These are powerful words, and I fully support and thank the Zuni Public School District for speaking out on this matter. We should all be this concerned. Mr. President, I ask unanimous consent that the entire letter from the Zuni Public School Board be included in the record following the rest of my remarks.
Without objection.
During her nomination hearing, Ms. DeVos demonstrated over and over that she is unfamiliar with even basic education issues and failed to commit to uphold the responsibilities of the Secretary of Education to support public schools. Given that Ms. DeVos has no relevant experience as a teacher or school administrator, we should be very concerned with entrusting her to enforce key protections under Title IX, under IDEA, and other civil rights laws. In particular, Ms. DeVos's lack of commitment to the Office of Civil Rights within the Department of Education, combined with the fact that she and her family have donated enormous sums of money to organizations that are anti-LGBTQ, women's rights, anti-Muslim, is simply troubling. The mission of the Office of Civil Rights is to ensure equal access to education and to promote educational excellence throughout the nation with vigorous enforcement of civil rights. During her nomination hearing, Ms. DeVos would not commit to continuing the office's policies that are making our college campuses safer by focusing on prevention and response to sexual assault. In fact, she has donated money to organizations that actually make it harder to prosecute sexual assault on our college campuses. As amazing as that sounds, it is true. If my Republican colleagues rubber stamp this nominee, they will confirm a Secretary of Education that doesn't believe in public schools, who will unravel rural education, and has even worked to make it harder to protect women against sexual assault on college campuses. I believe that we have a moral imperative to ensure that all students have equal protections while attending school. Ms. DeVos will be a massive step in the wrong direction. As the members of the Zuni Pueblo wrote to me in their letter, our children are our most sacred gifts. This is what we're voting on with this confirmation. We need an education secretary who is committed to upholding these principles. We need an education secretary who is committed to ensuring that every student has access to quality education, regardless of their background or their zip code, regardless of their ethnicity or their religion, regardless of their gender or sexual orientation. In the last few weeks, my office has fielded thousands of calls and letters asking me to oppose this nomination. I've heard from more than 8,000 constituents on this one topic alone, many of whom called as parents, as teachers, some as students. That's more than any other Trump nominee that we have considered to date. Never has an education secretary nomination received so much attention and opposition. And Mr. President, I stand with the thousands of parents, of teachers, and of students across the country and in my home state of New Mexico fighting to stop this nomination. And I would urge my colleagues to join me in voting no. Mr. President, I would suggest the absence of quorum.
Clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Alexander. Happy to do it. Ms. Baldwin.
Mr. President.
Senator from West Virginia.
Are we still on quorum call?
The Senate is in a quorum call.
I'd like to officiate for quorum call.
Without objection.
Mr. President, I rise to express my concern with the nomination of Betsy DeVos as the Secretary of Education. And I think if you knew my state, the state of West Virginia, we're a state made up of a lot of small towns. We don't have any large, what you would call large metropolitan areas. So we're an urban, rural state. For many communities in West Virginia, our schools are more than just classrooms, teachers and textbooks. Our children in West Virginia learn more than in their public schools than reading, writing, and arithmetic. They're the heart of the community and a home away from home for most of them. They're a safe place to stay after school where no harm will come to them. They're a place where nutritional meals are served and health care services are provided by trusted school nurses. After meeting with Ms. DeVos and watching her answer questions at her confirmation hearing, I have a hard time believing that she has the qualifications to be the Secretary of Education. I believe in local control of education, and also that strong public schools are vital to our state's future. Everything, it's a local, education is local. Our 55 counties, each one of the counties are responsible for the financing of the schools. And if the counties do not have the sufficient funds, we have what we call a school aid formula that basically offsets that in order so every child in West Virginia will get a quality education opportunity for one. In my state, charter schools and school vouchers would pull already limited public funds and resources from the schools, and students and teachers that need it the most could be harmed and would probably be harmed. There are some towns in West Virginia with only one school only, or where students have to travel far for more than an hour on a bus just to get to the school that has been consolidated. Voucher policies would be completely useless in these places. There's no place for them to attend. In areas where there are a few private schools in my state, a voucher program would have devastating effects for public school children. The limited dollars that we do have, if you deviate that money whatsoever, then basically you're going to have the strain on the public system that won't be able to pick it up in the rural areas. There's just no other way for us to have the funding that we need. Vouchers will siphon public funding away from our public schools, causing them to have to cut resources like teachers, advanced coursework, and preschool programs. And they often do not pay the entire cost of attendance at a private school, making them unusable by low-income students and families. Vouchers also can strip students with disabilities and their families of their rights under the Individuals with Disability Education Act. The most troubling part of that is in that hearing, if you watched it or saw any parts of it, it was a lack of understanding that every child deserves the opportunity for quality education, no matter what his or her disabilities may be. That's a responsibility that we have as an American. With that, if you've never been in a public school setting, you've never attended a public school yourself, and have always been privately schooled, your children have never attended a public school and have always either been private school or home school, you've probably never been in a setting where you've seen a disabled child trying to get the opportunities that other children have with a special aid that's working with them. Now you can say that's a waste of resources. Well, I guess you could say that if it wasn't your child. If it wasn't somebody you knew, it'd be easy to say that, but you know, just the empathy that you would have. So it would be hard for a person to understand that. And I believe that's a compelling reason to make me take pause in saying that I believe that we need somebody that has had that diversity, has had that real classroom experience. Another thing, never to be in a PTA meeting to where you have problems with schools. You might have problems with the bus and transportation. You might have problems with extracurricular activity or lunch programs or a routine study program to where you can sit down with other parents and work through these programs. That's something that's hard for most of us in West Virginia to ever conceive that you could ever be in that position, ever have that experience in life. I believe communities in West Virginia know our students' needs better than someone who really never attended or worked in the public school system. Many West Virginians have called and written to me expressing their concern about Ms. DeVos. I have a letter I want to read from Diane from Marion County, my home county, We've got hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of letters that have come in. Diane writes, I'm asking you to vote against the confirmation of Mrs. Betsy DeVos as Secretary of Education. As an educator with 44 years of experience in public schools, I recognize we have many issues. But I also know we do much that is right for children. Educators no longer simply teach core content. We know that children can only thrive if their social, emotional, and physical needs are met. The whole child is now the focus of every teacher, and teaching has become a very difficult but a very rewarding job. Educators need and deserve a Secretary of Education that knows and understands the tremendous responsibility each of us has accepted. We do not have the time to get the leader in step with us. We need and deserve someone who understands how policies can impact what we are able to do for our children. We need and deserve someone who understands the value of academic growth versus proficiency. We need and deserve someone who understands how important it is to send food home in backpacks because our children will not eat during a weekend or holiday break. I want to stop right there and give you a personal experience. When I was governor of the state of West Virginia, I always would go around to the schools. The school usually told me what was going on in the community. I would always go to the cooks because they really had the pulse of the school. And this was May, and school was getting ready to let out for the summer. And one of the cooks was crying in the kitchen. I couldn't figure what was wrong. I went back and tried to console her and talk to her, and I says, can you explain, why are you so upset? You're just about, out for the summer. She says, I know these little kids aren't going to eat much this summer. She wanted to stay and cook through the summer, have all year so the kids would have nutrition. That tells you what we're dealing with in an awful lot of rural settings. We need and deserve a leader who knows, and almost every teacher utilizes his or her own personal funds to buy pencils, paper, classroom supplies, and instructional materials for our students because the budget for what our children deserve is not given to us. That's the strain we already have on the system now. Put any more strain on that by taking funds away, it makes it almost impossible. My request is not politically motivated. My request for you is to vote against Mrs. DeVos. About the teachers I work with in Marion County and across West Virginia, one of the pillars of a great civilization is education. Although the American system of education is not perfect, we are still envied by many nations. Education is a hope for children of poverty as well as those who have economic security. Please encourage President Trump to seek out a former or current state superintendent of education or a chancellor of higher education or anyone with the knowledge to walk in step with us as we make a brighter future for our children. During her hearing, Ms. DeVos demonstrated a lack of the knowledge about the basic issues in public education, including the debate about how best to measure student progress. She also did not appear to have a solid understanding about the amount of student loan debt in this country, which is now the second largest source of consumer debt in the United States, surpassed only by home mortgages. Not only does she lack the institutional knowledge, but she has no personal family experience with a student loan system or any experience running a major loan program, like the one she would be in charge of as Secretary of Education. This leads me to believe that she would be unable to run the program effectively and efficiently. And what I've said and spoke to other people about, I understand, and I think most of us have been in Washington long enough, understand how the system works. Even though the person would have the greatest of intent, the most honorable of intent, wanting to do a balanced job. But if they've never had the experience, and basically they're charged with setting up programs that basically is supposed to get incentivized. Schools, school districts, states. Those programs are not going to lean to where they have no knowledge. Those programs will go to where they have the most knowledge and the direction their policies they believe in. With that being said, the incentives will go in that direction. The incentives go in that direction. It pulls further resources away from a rural public education system. At her hearing, Ms. DeVos failed to recognize that Individuals with Disability Education Act is a federal law protecting access for individuals with disabilities to a decent public education, and that she would be in charge of ensuring that the school implemented the act. No child should ever be denied access to the same public education because they suffer from a disability. As both a governor and a father, I can never look at a parent in the eyes and tell them that their child could not get the same education as another child simply because they suffer from a disability, and it would be too costly for us to do. West Virginians need an education secretary who has an understanding of the needs of all children, including those with disabilities, and is committed to ensuring they receive a quality education. A strong education is a building block for success for every child and the foundation for our country's long-term economic strength. We need an education secretary that understands the challenges that students, teachers, and schools in rural areas face. Betsy DeVos has spent her career working in the private public school system, not investing in and improving the public school system. The policies that Mrs. DeVos supports would divert public funds to private schools, whether it was intentional or not, strip accountability from these schools, and significantly harm the public school system in my little state of West Virginia, which is all we have. Mr. President, it's difficult to speak, and I don't make it personal. I try not to make it personal because I don't believe in the toxic rhetoric that goes on sometimes in this room when it shouldn't, in this great Senate chamber of ours, and definitely on the Hill. And so I know this is probably a great lady, a good lady, who is well-intended. She just doesn't have that personal experience it takes to grab this entire country and understand that we're different. States are different. We depend on it. We can't always go in one direction. And that's the flexibility. They're saying, well, we'll give you flexibility. Well, we need the support from Washington to have the flexibility to make sure the children in West Virginia have the same opportunities that a child in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania might have in a larger school district, one in a metropolitan area that could afford, because you don't have all the travel and everything else that's involved, that they could afford to basically maybe have a charter school. In my state, even the legislature couldn't. They've looked at charter and voucher systems, and they couldn't find a pathway forward because of the limited funding. And knowing that it would divert. If there's no more funding going into it, that means you've got to cut the pie more. And they were concerned about even going in this direction. And my legislature in the last 2 years has flipped completely to a Republican majority in both the House and Senate. All good people, well-intended. They're looking at all these different avenues. But at the end of the day, you've got to take care of those who you're responsible for. And in rural West Virginia, that's a child who might have to ride 1 hour just to go to school. I don't know where you would put a charter school. I don't know where, with a voucher system, you could send them. If we have a problem in deficiencies, that's basically the responsibility of the county and the community. It's the responsibility of the parents and guardians to be involved. It's a responsibility for all of us to speak up. Well, I guess what we're going to end up is all the children with disability, or children that basically have not the means, or a person in their family that's able to drive them or take them to a special school, they're all going to be left so-called behind. It's just not who we are in West Virginia. And I ask for your consideration that maybe we can find a secretary who has the experience and understands and has the real-life experience. They might have attended a public school themselves. I'm a product, I'm sure you're a product of private education. Public schools, yeah. Wasn't a lot of private in Oklahoma or West Virginia. But we are a product of the public school systems. Probably more than likely rural public school systems. We did pretty well with them. People cared. We had to give a little bit and make some sacrifices, and we did that. But the bottom line is that there was no options. We made the best out of what we had. And these kids aren't going to have options. The majority of kids in West Virginia or Oklahoma won't have those options. And you better make sure that school system you have in that rural setting, a public school setting in a rural setting, is giving that child every opportunity that he and she can excel. And who knows, maybe one day they'll be sitting in my seat or your seat. I hope so. For with that, I'd say that I must oppose her secretary position that she has been achieving, that President Trump has put her forward to, with all due respect. And I think I've stated my reasons for that, but I would hope that people would understand that our rural public schools truly need a champion. We need that champion to really step forward and lift us all up. And with that, I would yield the floor, Mr. President.
Mr. President.
Senator from Massachusetts.
Thank you, Mr. President, very much. I am here this afternoon to stand up to one of the most dangerous nominees in President Trump's cabinet of big oil and big banks and big billionaires who are going to be populating the cabinet of the United States. The Secretary of Education is responsible for a budget that includes $36 billion for elementary and secondary education, $150 billion for higher education each year. And on top of that, the Secretary of Education is responsible for more than $1.2 trillion in outstanding federal loans. This nominee, Betsy DeVos, would shape the policies and programs that affect more than 50 million students across our country. Young people may just be 16% of our population, but young people represent 100% of the future of the United States. And we need a Secretary of Education that believes that all children deserve access to a quality public education, regardless of income, race, ethnicity, neighborhood, or disability status. Betsy DeVos does not share this commitment to equal opportunity, and she is unqualified to serve as Secretary of Education. Betsy DeVos has a long and well-documented record of opposing public school systems. She has implemented school choice voucher programs. She has simultaneously expanded and deregulated charter schools. In Massachusetts, we recognize that education is a passport to the job opportunities of the 21st century. Massachusetts students at the 4th, 8th, and 10th grades are #1 in America in math, verbal, and science. We're #1. Math, verbal, and science, 4th, 8th, and 10th grades. If Massachusetts were a country, we would be second behind Singapore in reading for the whole planet. That's Massachusetts. Now, we have a very high percentage of our students who are minorities in our home state. I live in Malden. Malden is a city of 60,000 people. Malden High School, 2016 graduation class, 28% white, 25% Asian, 24% Latino, 23% black, 1% Pacific Islander. 28, 25, 24, 23, 1. What is our goal? Well, our goal in Malden, our goal in Massachusetts is to be #1. #1, not just in the United States, but #1 in the world. We know you can do it if you make a commitment to these kids. And it's not just our traditional public schools, it's our public charter schools. Our private schools, our preparatory schools are enormously successful. Many of them are world famous, these high schools that are sent, that people send their children from around the country to go to a school in Massachusetts. But the success of our public charter schools is largely due to very strong accountability measures brought about through state regulations and rigorous oversight. That's the key to our charter school system. It's accountability, it's oversight. It's you're not going to be draining money out of the charter school system for profits for private corporations. It has to be invested in the kids. But Betsy DeVos wants charter schools to have less accountability and has fought to keep charter schools unregulated across Michigan. When the Michigan State Legislature introduced a bipartisan bill that would have expanded oversight of charter schools, Betsy DeVos stepped in. She and her family donated $1.45 million to state legislators in order to strip the helpful oversight accountability language out of the bill. That works out to $25,000 a day over a 7-week period the bill was being debated. Betsy DeVos and her unlimited funding ultimately succeeded in blocking the common sense accountability legislation, and the students and families of Detroit were denied the key protections and oversight that their schools needed. But Betsy DeVos's school choice priorities go beyond expanding and deregulating charter schools. She has pushed for voucher programs that would use taxpayer money, your money, to pay for a child's private school tuition. Under a national voucher system, the funding that would normally go to local school districts would instead be diverted away from public schools towards the for-profit private institutions. In addition to the private schools that benefit from a voucher system, 80% of the charter schools in Michigan are run by for-profit companies, a much higher percentage than any other state. And these companies are focused first and foremost on making money. We don't allow this to happen in Massachusetts. We have only one goal, and that is to be number one. That money must stay in the school system, especially if you're trying to educate a minority population, which is the future workforce of our country. That's key. They don't come from the traditional backgrounds in many circumstances. The Secretary of Education must fight for all children and families, not promote companies seeking to profit off the backs of our students. Not even Michigan, the state where DeVos and her family money have tried to exert the most influence over education policy, has implemented a statewide voucher system, despite spending $5.6 million on a campaign to promote school vouchers. The DeVos family failed to amend Michigan's state constitution. If Betsy DeVos is allowed to expand her school choice policies across the United States, it would be devastating for our students and for the future of our country. Her ideas are too extreme. They will not work for our students or for school districts in our nation. I also share serious doubts that Betsy DeVos will support all students in America. The Individuals with Disabilities Education Act is the primary federal law that ensures that all students in every state have access to a free and appropriate public education, regardless of physical or mental handicaps, learning or attention disorders. This law covers students who are blind, deaf, vocally or mobility impaired, and those with autism or ADHD. Congress passed the original form of IDEA in 1975. It is a bedrock law in our country. Yet when Betsy DeVos was asked about it during her nomination hearing before the HELP committee, she stated that states should be responsible for determining how and even if to enforce the IDEA. Now remember, IDEA goes right to the heart of what we're going to do for those kids with disabilities. And that's a bedrock law in our nation. States must abide by it. We need a Secretary of Education who understands long-standing federal education law and will commit to protecting every student in America, because every student deserves the guarantee that they can and they will receive a free and appropriate public education that is promised and protected by law. If this laundry list of efforts to undermine public education wasn't enough to cause skepticism about Betsy DeVos's qualifications to be Secretary of Education, in her confirmation hearing, Betsy DeVos would not commit to keeping guns out of our schools. Her response when asked about the issue was, quote, "I think that's best left to locals and states to decide. Guns do not belong anywhere near our schools or our students and teachers, not in public or private schools, not in elementary schools, and not in our high schools. I am proud to have stood with Senators Chris Murphy and Richard Blumenthal on the floor of the Senate for 15 hours, calling for congressional action on common sense gun safety legislation. And as a senator, the safety and security of Massachusetts schools, neighborhoods, and communities are my top priority. Our Secretary of Education has the safety of every student in every state in his or her hands, and I do not believe Betsy DeVos is up to that job. I do not stand alone in this conclusion that Betsy DeVos is unfit to be Secretary of Education. I have received tens of thousands of letters and phone calls from constituents all across Massachusetts urging me to reject her nomination. Many of these come from teachers and administrators, the people who work on these issues every day. I have a letter here from Todd Simon Dinger, the principal of Rockport Elementary School in Rockport, Massachusetts, who wrote to me last week and said, quote, Senator Markey, as a strong supporter of public education, I ask that you oppose the confirmation of Betsy DeVos as Secretary of Education. We must have a secretary who can commit to supporting every student in all public schools and provide leadership that will help our neighborhood schools succeed. Betsy DeVos's record in education and her performance at the recent confirmation hearing proved that she is the wrong candidate for the job. As a principal, I have spoken with teachers, parents, students, and community members who agree that America's future depends on a strong investment in our nation's public schools. The offices of so many of my colleagues who have spoken on the floor already have, like me, received these kinds of letters and messages literally on a minute-by-minute basis from our constituents. Their passion is born of a deep commitment to ensuring that the very best education for all of the children of the Commonwealth can only be provided if the standards for that education is high. And I commend them and I agree with their concerns. All children deserve that standard. And so from my perspective, you can't have a more fundamental issue before us, this privatization of the public school system in America, the voucherization of our public school system in America. There's a model. It's Massachusetts. We do it right now. We're #1 in the country. And we look over our shoulders at those who are behind us. But it's a standard that basically says we are going to invest in the public schools, in the charter schools. We're going to make sure that they have the highest possible standards. And that's a recipe for ensuring that every child, regardless of their nationality or their income, gets an education they need for a portable passport to a global economy for the rest of their lives. That has to be our goal. What's happening using the philosophy of Betsy DeVos is a failure. It's a proven failure. We already see the results. What's happening in Massachusetts, what happens in implementing the standards of the laws that we already have on the books across our country, it points us in the correct direction. So, with that, Mr. President, I urge a no vote on Betsy DeVos and her nomination as Secretary of the Education Department, and I yield back the balance of my time, and I question the presence of a quorum.
Clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Alexander.
Mr. President.
Senator from Massachusetts.
Thank you, Mr. President. Mr. President.
The Senate is in a quorum call.
I ask unanimous consent that the quorum call be dispensed with.
Without objection.
Thank you, Mr. President. Mr. President, American history was made last night. The Boston Patriots won the Super Bowl. And this triumvirate of Robert Kraft, Bill Belichick, and Tom Brady continue this historic journey to being recognized as the greatest single football team in the history of the United States. And even as the Falcons were ahead by 25 points, even as the rest of the country thought that the game was over, we in Massachusetts, we in New England, we have our own model. In Belichick, we trust. In Brady, we trust. We knew that it was not over. We knew that there was still hope. We knew that there was a plan that could be implemented that would ensure that the Patriots once again would prevail. And so I thank you, Mr. President, for giving me this opportunity to be recognized on this most important of all subjects. This incredible Patriots victory has brought joy to people all across New England. It's brought dismay to people in other parts of the country. They still continue to be mystified about this incredible team and the incredible leadership that those three great leaders provide. But for us, we realize that we're in the presence of greatness. We know how spoiled we are to have such a great team. And I just wanted to rise and congratulate the New England Patriots, their leadership of Bob Kraft, Bill Belichick, Tom Brady, but all of this team, because their motto is a very simple motto. It says, do your job. And that's what every Patriot did last night. And because they stuck it out through every single play, at the end of the day, they were able to enjoy that historic victory. And so for my part, I can't be more proud of any group of New Englanders. It was just a fantastic victory. As a season ticket holder, when I was 19 years old, when it was 7 games at $6 a piece, $42 as a season ticket holder at Fenway Park, you can imagine how almost impossible it is to believe that we have reached such a stage where even those who have been critics of the Patriots now are forced to recognize that Bill Belichick is the greatest coach of all time. Tom Brady is the greatest quarterback of all time. And the Patriots, led by Robert Kraft, are the greatest franchise of all time. And we are very proud that that victory last night cemented that place in history. And once again, I just want to congratulate each and every one of them, and especially the Patriots fans who through thick and thin have been with that team every step of the way. And with that, Mr. President, I yield back the balance of my time. The presence of a quorum.
Clerk would call the roll.
Mr. Alexander.
Mr. President.
Senator from New Jersey.
I ask unanimous consent that the quorum call be vitiated.
Without objection.
Mr. President, I rise today as a product of the New Jersey public schools, the son of Cuban refugees whose parents decided to leave everything behind because they did not like a dictatorship from the right and did not like what they saw in the Sierra Maestras as the Castros were seeking to overthrow that government from the right, and who fled their own country in order to seek a better life in the United States. They were the lucky ones. They saw the handwriting on the wall, and they got out before the true brutality of the Castro regime took hold in Cuba. When they arrived here, they had nothing more than the promise of a brighter future, and if not for them, then for their children. In so many ways, it's a quintessential immigrant story, indeed a quintessential American story. My mother worked as a seamstress in the factories of New Jersey. My father was an itinerant carpenter. We didn't have a lot of money, just enough to live in a small apartment in a tenement in Union City and put food on the table. But that was plenty. It was plenty because my parents knew that living in America gave their children access to a free public education. And they always taught us that an education was the key towards a better life. Now, growing up, I was a quiet kid. I was very studious. I got good grades, but I struggled with public speaking. I know some of my colleagues wouldn't believe that today, but it's true. Unfortunately for me, one of the final requirements before I graduated high school was a public speech class. Again, I did all the work, but I refused to actually stand up in front of the class and speak, and I thought I could get away with it, but my teacher, Gail Harper, had other ideas. She kept me out after class. She forced me to recite short stories and poetry and speeches I had written that were part of the classwork after my classmates left. Eventually, she told me that I was going to be the narrator in a school production, which meant that I was going to be speaking on stage in front of the entire student body. I was petrified. And I was inclined to refuse. I'm not sure if there would have been a more terrifying thought to me in the world than having to get up in front of my entire student body. But Ms. Harper told me that she knew that I could succeed, and that if I refused, however, that she would have no choice but to fail me. And if you knew my mother, my late mother, that was not an option. So I swallowed my fear, and when I got out there, I found that Ms. Harper's work paid off. Not only did I realize that I could overcome all of that fear and anxieties, but it had instilled in me a hunger to keep working, to get better at speaking in front of people, a skill that I honestly owe my life's work to. For me, Ms. Harper was so much more than a teacher. She was a mentor and one of the unsung heroes of our public education system. And I'm privileged to have had an opportunity to tell her that during her lifetime. Now, thanks to my parents' commitment and incredible public school teachers like Ms. Harper, this product of New Jersey public schools went out to get a law degree from Rutgers University, a state institution, and was able to rise from a tenement in Union City to one of 100 senators in a country of over 300 million people. I got my start in politics fighting for public schools in my hometown. When I was in high school, I was told that because of my grades and my activities, I could be in the senior honors program, but that I had to cough up $200 for the books. My parents were poor. We lived in a tenement. I didn't have $200 for the books, and I couldn't understand for the life of me if I had the ability and the grades, but not the money, that I'd be barred from being in the honors program. So I raised such a ruckus that they gave me the books, told me to be quiet, and they put me in the honors program, but I had friends who had the same circumstances. They had the ability and the grades. They didn't have the money, and unlike me, they didn't say anything, and they didn't get in. So I didn't think that was right, and I petitioned to change the school board from being appointed by the mayor at the time to elected by the public. And ultimately, I won a fight to change that school board and became the youngest school board member at the time in history when I was 20 years old. So I understand the promise of public education. I understand the challenges that come with it. I understand the need for parental engagement and the extraordinary impact that good teachers can have on our children's lives. I understand that our schools need access to adequate resources in order to allow every student to reach their full potential. And I understand that we have a long way to go to ensure that we truly do guarantee every child in America equal access to a high-quality public education, regardless of where they live, regardless of the happenstance of where they were born, regardless of their station in life. Most importantly, I understand that our public education system has formed the foundation upon which the American dream has been built for generations. It is the great socializing factor of our nation, and there is no substitute for it. At its core, it's an all-taker system. It does not care whether you are wealthy or poor, whether your family predates European settlement, came on the Mayflower, or is a first-generation American. It does not care whether you are white or black or Hispanic or Asian or Christian or Jewish or Muslim. It does not care whether you struggle with learning disabilities or autism or Down syndrome. Our public education system welcomes you in with open arms and adheres to the fundamental principles that all are welcome, all are equal, and all deserve a chance to learn and earn a better life for themselves and their families. While we work to improve public education and renew our commitment to our children, we need a partner in the Federal Department of Education that also understands these challenges and shares our values. Unfortunately, I do not believe that Betsy DeVos is that candidate. While I do not question her intentions, her limited experience and advocacy for policies that fundamentally undermine public education make her unqualified to be the Secretary of Education. Mrs. DeVos has never participated in the public education system that she would be tasked with overseeing, either as a student or a parent or a teacher or an administrator. I don't see that fact in and of itself alone as disqualifying, but coupled with the policies that she has advocated for in her home state of Michigan, pushing for more charter schools while simultaneously working against accountability for them, even as they profit off the backs of children while showing little improvement in student outcomes. Advocating for voucher schemes that put public funding into private schools, even for families that do not need the additional assistance, while depriving public schools of vital funding that they depend upon to provide a quality education to every student. It becomes clear that Mrs. DeVos does not understand that fundamental commitment to American children. My concerns about Mrs. DeVos were compounded by the answers she gave in her confirmation hearing before the HELP Committee. Guns have no place in our schools, at least in my view, except in the hands of trained law enforcement personnel tasked with keeping our children safe. Yet when asked if she would do away with gun-free school zones, if told so by the president, Mrs. DeVos, after trying to avoid the question with a non-answer about grizzly bears attacking schools, said that she would support the president. I do not believe that it is the role of a cabinet secretary to simply and blindly support the president, regardless of how misguided or dangerous an idea might be. Nor do I believe that it is reasonable or responsible to make it easier to bring guns in and around schools where they endanger our children. We must do a better job securing universal background checks and treating mental health issues, but more guns is not the answer. Mrs. DeVos also said in her testimony that she believed that compliance with the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act should be left up to the states. IDEA, as the act is known, guarantees a free, IDEA I should say, guarantees a free, appropriate public education that is individualized to meet the needs of every student with disabilities. When Congress first passed IDEA in 1975, though it was called then the Education for All Handicapped Children, it came with a promise that the federal government would cover 40% of the cost to educate those with special needs. Unfortunately, we have not met that obligation, providing less than half of that funding in recent history. Now, IDEA is federal, not state law. It is federal law that needs increased funding and attention from the federal government. And when this was pointed out to Mrs. DeVos, she said simply that she, quote, may have been confused. Our children with disabilities deserve a real federal partner that understands the challenges they face and is committed to getting them the resources that they deserve, not a Secretary of Education who is confused about the federal role in education. These are only a few examples of how Mrs. DeVos has shown herself to be unprepared and unqualified for the very serious position to which she has been nominated. If confirmed, Mrs. DeVos would take over a multi-billion-dollar federal student aid and student loan program that helps American families afford the skyrocketing costs of higher education. I myself was a recipient of Pell Grants and other federal student aid and would not have been able to afford the cost of a college degree without them. Yet not only does Mrs. DeVos have no experience with student loans or managing such a program, but she has very little, if any, engagement with any policy issues pertaining to higher education. And at a time when trillions of dollars of student debt are acting as a barrier to obtaining a higher education, hindering a generation of graduates from entering the middle class, and acting as a drag on our economy, we deserve a nominee who understands these issues. As we continue to struggle with the best ways to measure student progress and achievement, we deserve a Secretary of Education that understands basic concepts like the difference between proficiency and growth. So let me just say, my own experiences have given me an incredible faith in the power of public education systems, while Mrs. DeVos has only worked to undermine it. I believe that the federal government can be a strong partner in ensuring a free, quality public education for all students, especially those with disabilities, while Mrs. DeVos seems to think that the federal government should not be involved in these endeavors. I believe that guns must remain out of our schools, but Mrs. DeVos seems to indicate that they could have a place there. And most importantly, I believe that our students, parents, teachers, and educators should be able to trust the person tasked with overseeing them. And the 50,000 New Jerseyans who have reached out to me to oppose her nomination have clearly shown that she has not earned that trust. Here is one example of a constituent who reached out to my office. Dear Senator, my name is Beth Moore, and I live in your great state of New Jersey in Fanwood in Union County. I am writing today to express my deep opposition to the appointment of Betsy DeVos as Secretary of Education. As a mother of 2 boys in our public school system and one with special needs, I am deeply concerned and troubled by Mrs. DeVos's lack of public school experience. In fact, the thought of her steering money and funding away from public school is not only a threat to my children, but a threat to the 50 million other children currently receiving a public education. She lacks understanding in even the most basic issues that affect our schools, and that, my senator, is scary. I urge you to strongly oppose this and tell your other colleagues in the Senate to do the same. So I implore my colleagues to put politics aside, examine Mrs. DeVos's qualifications closely, and to be open to the input that you're all receiving from your own constituents like Beth Moore. And I hope that if you are open in your mind in that regard, you will oppose Betsy DeVos's nomination to be Secretary of Education, as I will. With that, Mr. President, I yield the floor.
Clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Alexander.
Mr. President.
The Republican leader.
I ask consent the quorum call be dispensed with.
Without objection.
I ask unanimous consent that the appointments at the desk appear separately in the record as if made by the chair.
Is there objection? Without objection.
I suggest the absence of quorum.
Clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Alexander. Ms. Baldwin, Mr. Barrasso, Mr. Bennett, Mr. Blumenthal, Mr. Blunt, Mr. Booker, Mr. Bozeman, Mr. Brown, Mr. Burr, Ms. Cantwell, Mrs. Capito, Mr. Cardin, Mr. Carper, Mr. Casey, Mr. Cassidy, Mr. Cochran, Ms. Collins, Mr. Coons, Mr. Corker, Mr. Cornyn, Ms. Cortez Masto, Mr. Cotton, Mr. Crapo, Mr. Cruz,
Human votes aye.
Mr. Daines, Mr. Donnelly, Ms. Duckworth, Mr. Durbin, Mr. Enzi, Mrs. Ernst, Mrs. Feinstein, Mrs. Fisher, Mr. Flake, Mr. Franken, Mr. Gardner, Mrs. Gillibrand, Mr. Graham, Mr. Grassley, Ms. Harris, Ms. Hassan, Mr. Hatch, Mr. Heinrich, Ms. Heitkamp, Mr. Heller, Ms. Hirono, Mr. Hoven, Mr. Inhofe, Mr. Isaacson, Mr. Johnson, Mr. Kane, Mr. Kennedy, Mr. King, Ms. Klobuchar, Mr. Langford, Mr. Leahy, Mr. Lee. Thank you. Mr. Lee, Mr. Manchin, Mr. Markey, Mr. McCain, Mrs. McCaskill, Mr. McConnell, Mr. Menendez, Mr. Merkley, Mr. Moran, Ms. Murkowski, Mr. Murphy, Mrs. Murray, Mr. Nelson, Mr. Paul, Mr. Perdue, Mr. Peters, Mr. Portman, Mr. Reed, Mr. Risch, Mr. Roberts, Mr. Rounds, Mr. Rubio, Mr. Sanders, Mr. Sass, Mr. Schumer, Mr. Scott, Mr. Sessions, Mrs. Shaheen, Mr. Shelby, Ms. Stabenow, Mr. Sullivan, Mr. Tester, Mr. Thune, Mr. Tillis, Mr. Toomey, Mr. Udall, Mr. Van Hollen, Mr. Warner, Ms. Warren, Mr. Whitehouse, Mr. Wicker, Mr. Wyden, Mr. Young.
And then you do it.
Quorum is not present. Clerk will call the names of the absent senators.
Mr. Alexander, Ms. Baldwin, Mr. Barrasso, Mr. Bennett, Mr. Blumenthal, Mr. Blunt, Mr. Booker, Mr. Bozeman, Mr. Brown, Mr. Burr, Mr. Cardin, Mr. Carper, Mr. Casey, Mr. Cassidy, Mr. Cochran, Ms. Collins, Mr. Coons, Mr. Corker, Ms. Cortez Masto, Mr. Crapo, Mr. Cruz, Mr. Daines, Ms. Duckworth, Mr. Durbin, Mr. Enzi, Mrs. Ernst, Mrs. Feinstein, Mr. Flake, Mr. Franken, Mr. Gardner, Mrs. Gillibrand, Mr. Graham, Ms. Harris, Ms. Hassan, Mr. Hatch, Mr. Heinrich, Ms. Heitkamp, Mr. Heller, Ms. Hirono, Mr. Hoven, Mr. Inhofe, Mr. Johnson, Mr. Kennedy, Mr. King, Ms. Klobuchar, Mr. Leahy, Mr. Lee, Mr. Manchin, Mr. Markey, Mrs. McCaskill, Mr. Merkley, Ms. Murkowski, Mrs. Murray, Mr. Nelson, Mr. Paul, Mr. Perdue, Mr. Peters, Mr. Portman, Mr. Reed, Mr. Risch, Mr. Roberts, Mr. Rounds, Mr. Rubio, Mr. Sanders, Mr. Sass, Mr. Schatz, Mr. Schumer, Mr. Scott, Mr. Sessions, Mrs. Shaheen, Mr. Shelby, Ms. Stabenow, Mr. Sullivan, Mr. Tester, Mr. Thune, Mr. Toomey, Mr. Udall, Mr. Van Hollen, Mr. Warner, Ms. Warren, Mr. Whitehouse, Mr. Wicker, Mr. Wyden, Mr. Young.
A quorum is not present.
Mr. President, I move to instruct the Sergeant at Arms to request the presence of absent senators, and I ask for the yeas and nays.
Is there a second? Sufficient second.
There appears to be.
There appears to be. Clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Alexander, Ms. Baldwin, Mr. Barrasso, Mr. Bennett, Mr. Blumenthal,
So you have me down.
yes, Mr. Blunt, Mr. Booker, Mr. Bozeman, Mr. Brown, Mr. Burr, Ms. Cantwell, Mrs. Capito, Mr. Cardin, Mr. Carper, Mr. Casey, Mr. Cassidy, Mr. Cochran, Ms. Collins, Mr. Coons, Mr. Corker, Mr. Cornyn, Ms. Cortez Masto, Mr. Cotton, Mr. Crapo, Mr. Cruz, Mr. Daines, Mr. Donnelly, Ms. Duckworth, Mr. Durbin, Mr. Enzi, Mrs. Ernst, Mrs. Feinstein, Mrs. Fisher, Mr. Flake, Mr. Franken, Mr. Gardner, Mrs. Gillibrand, Mr. Graham, Mr. Grassley, Ms. Harris, Ms. Hassan, Mr. Hatch, Mr. Heinrich, Ms. Heitkamp, Mr. Heller, Ms. Hirono, Mr. Hoven, Mr. Inhofe, Mr. Isaacson, Mr. Johnson, Mr. Kane, Mr. Kennedy, Mr. King, Ms. Klobuchar.
No.
Mr. Langford, Mr. Leahy. Sir. Thank you. How you doing? Mr. Lee, Mr. Manchin, Mr. Markey, Mr. McCain, Mrs. McCaskill, Mr. McConnell, Mr. Menendez, Mr. Merkley, Mr. Moran,
Present.
Ms. Murkowski, Mr. Murphy, Mrs. Murray, Mr. Nelson, Mr. Paul, Mr. Perdue, Mr. Peters, Mr. Portman, Mr. Reed, Mr. Risch, Mr. Roberts, Mr. Rounds, Mr. Rubio, Mr. Sanders, Mr. Sass, Mr. Schatz, Mr. Schumer, Mr. Scott, Mr. Sessions, Mrs. Shaheen, Mr. Shelby, Ms. Stabenow, Mr. Sullivan, Mr. Tester, Mr. Thune, Mr. Tillis, Mr. Toomey, Mr. Udall, Mr. Van Hollen, Mr. Warner, Ms. Warren, Mr. Whitehouse, Mr. Wicker, Mr. Wyden, Mr. Young, Senators voting in the affirmative: Barrasso, Booker, Burr, Cantwell, Capito, Cardin, Casey, Cassidy, Cochran, Coons, Cornyn, Cortez Masto, Crapo, Donnelly, Duckworth, Enzi, Feinstein, Fisher, Franken, Gardner, Gillibrand, Grassley, Hassan, Hatch, Heinrich, Inhofe, Isaacson, Klobuchar, Lankford, Manchin, McCain, Menendez, Merkley, Moran, Murphy, Murray, Peters, Reed, Roberts, Rounds, Rubio, Schatz, Shaheen, Sullivan, Tester, Tillis, Van Hollen, Warren, and Wyden. Senator Wicker voted in the negative. Mr. Rubio, no. Mr. Warner, aye. Mr. Johnson, aye. Ms. Stabenow, aye. Mr. Blunt, aye. Mr. Blumenthal, aye. Mr. Graham, aye. Mr. King, aye. Mr. Sanders, aye. Mr. Paul, aye. Mrs. McCaskill, aye. Mrs. Ernst, aye. Ms. Heitkamp, aye. Mr. Daines, aye. Mr. Whitehouse, aye. Ms. Harris, aye. Mr. Carper, aye. Mr. Nelson, aye. Ms. Baldwin, aye. Mr. Corker, aye. Mr. Kennedy, aye. Mr. Portman, aye. Ms. Collins, no. Mr. Leahy, aye. Mr. Schumer, aye. Mr. Shelby. Mr. Shelby, aye. Mr. Alexander, aye. Mr. Cruz, aye. Mr. Brown, aye. Mr. Heller, no. Ms. Hirono, aye. Mr. Young, no. Mr. Risch, aye. Mr. McConnell, aye. Mr. Bennett, aye. Mr. Perdue, aye. Mr. Young, aye. Mr. Markey, aye. Mr. Hoeven, aye. Mr. Lee, aye. Mr. Scott, aye. Mr. Cotton, aye. Mr. Durbin, aye. Mr. Sessions, aye. Mr. Thune, aye. Mr. Bozeman, aye.
Are there any senators in the chamber wishing to vote or desire to change their vote? If not, the yeas are 91, the nays are 4. The motion is agreed to. The Sergeant of Arms is so instructed. A quorum is present.
Mr. President.
The senator from Tennessee.
Thank you, Mr. President. Mr. President, sentence not in order.
Senate will be in order.
Thank you.
Senator from Tennessee is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. President. Mr. President, tonight the senator from Maryland, Senator Cardin, and I, and a bipartisan group of United States senators have introduced a resolution reaffirming the strong alliance between the United States and Australia. I'd like to speak about that just for a few minutes. I don't know what happened during last week's telephone call between the President of the United States and the Prime Minister of Australia, but I do know this: the people of the United States do not have better friends than the people of Australia. We're more than friends. As one Australian told me when our family lived there 30 years ago, well, we're mates all right, he said. The English may be our ancestors, but you Americans are our cousins, first cousins. We started out the same kind of people, my Australian friend said, underprivileged, a long way from home, doing the same kind of thing, looking for a new life, found a hard life, hoped it would be a better one for our children. Each wave of new ones lifted up the last ones. A pioneering spirit in the countryside here, the Australian said, in America too. Even though they live down under on the other side of the world, for a century Australians have stood with us every time we were at war. And we have stood with them. Mr. President, the Senate's not in session.
The senator is correct. The Senate will be in order. Please take the conversations out of the chamber. The senator from Tennessee.
Thank you, Mr. President. Even though they live down under on the other side of the world for a century, Australians have stood with us every time we were at war, and we've stood with them. During World War II, when Australian troops were fighting in North Africa and Europe, and the Japanese were bombing Darwin 4 times a day, the United States came to the rescue. In 1992, Dick Cheney and I, as member of President George H.W. Bush's cabinet, traveled to Townsville in Australia to celebrate the 50th anniversary of the Battle of the Coral Sea, when the United States Navy stopped Japan's advance. Today, no two countries trust one another and cooperate in security arrangements more than Australia and America. We trade, we visit one another, and our students study in each other's universities. 30 years ago, our family lived an American dream, and we moved to Australia. We arrived on Australia Day, January 26, 1987, 199 years after the first fleet of English settlers sailed into Sydney Harbor. After 8 years of swiveling in the governor's chair, on the very day I was sworn out of office, my wife Honey and I and our 4 children flew to Sydney for 6 months off in the land down under. It was my wife's idea, an opportunity for a retreat from the merry-go-round of power and to discover what really was important. We rented a home in view of the most beautiful harbor in the world, bought an Australian car, and I learned to drive on the wrong side of the road. Our 4 children walked to Australian schools. We all sank deeply into the culture of our America's favorite cousins. I attended Chester A. Arthur Society meetings, where Australian Parliament members competed to show that they know more about United States history than American United States senators do. We spent the night in the South Wales bush. We saw 9-foot crocodiles in the Northwest Territory. We traveled by train to see the Melbourne Zoo and took a horseback trip across the Snowy Mountains. It didn't take long for us to understand what Mark Twain meant when he wrote, "When a stranger from America steps ashore in Sydney, the thing that strikes him is that it's an English city with American trimmings." Mr. President, we made friends then, that exist to this day. Last year, 4 of those friends, the Australian Foreign Minister Bob Carr and the Australian Ambassador to the United States Kim Beazley and their wives, spent the weekend with us at our home outside the Great Smoky Mountains in Tennessee. We cherish those friendships and our country's relationship with Australia. It is always appropriate for the United States Senate to reaffirm the importance of that relationship, and I'm glad to join Senator Cardin and a long list of bipartisan United States senators who do that again today. To offer a more complete understanding of what makes Australians our favorite cousins, I ask consent to include in the record Chapter 30 from my book, 6 Months Off, written after our time in Australia.
Without objection.
Thank the President, and I yield the floor.
Wisconsin? Is that right? Wisconsin?
Mr. President.
The Senate.
Ask 30 seconds of recognition.
Yes.
Senator from Tennessee.
I ask consent to include in the record, following my remarks, the bipartisan resolution introduced by Senator Cardin and a number of other senators today.
Is there objection? Seeing none, so ordered.
Thank you very much.
The Senator from Wisconsin.
Thank you. Mr. President, I rise to urge my colleagues to join me in opposing the nomination of Betsy DeVos to be Secretary of Education. And simply put, Betsy DeVos is completely unqualified to serve as Secretary of Education in this great nation. Many others share this view. I have heard from thousands of parents and teachers and other citizens of Wisconsin who are concerned about the future of our educational system and urging me to oppose Mrs. DeVos and certainly opposing her vision for America's students. As of today, over 20,000 Wisconsinites have emailed me. We've had over 7,000 phone calls opposing the confirmation of Mrs. DeVos. And Senate Democrats are unified in our opposition to Mrs. DeVos serving in this capacity. Even 2 Senate Republicans have announced that they cannot support Betsy DeVos. If just one more of my Republican colleagues were to announce their opposition, were to vote no, we could do the right thing and tell President Trump that he really needs to find a new candidate for Secretary of Education who is qualified to run that department. Now, while Betsy DeVos has spent decades advocating for a particular vision for education, she has never actually worked as a teacher or as an administrator. Her career has involved investing hers and her family's considerable wealth and using those resources to advance privatization of our K-12 education system. Now, she did not attend a public school, either for grade school or high school or college, and nor did her children. And she has never worked as a teacher, a principal, a professor, a counselor, or in any other formal role in our education system. Her confirmation hearing before the Health, Education, Labor, and Pensions Committee clearly demonstrated how little she knows about federal education law and policy. It was startling to see her ignorance about critical measures like the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, or the debate over growth versus proficiency as a measure of student achievement. Betsy DeVos has demonstrated that she neither has the knowledge nor the experience in education that would allow her to be a successful leader of the Department of Education. Now, Mrs. DeVos has worked to advance a vision of K through 12 education that is fundamentally hostile to our public education system. My home state of Wisconsin has a long and very proud tradition of support for public education. Back at the founding of our state, we wrote the guarantee that every child should receive a free public education into our very founding document, our state constitution. Wisconsin had the first kindergarten in the United States. Wisconsin is proud of something that we actually call the Wisconsin idea in higher education, that the walls of the classroom should be the borders of the state, if not the borders of this nation or the entire world. Mrs. DeVos's experience in education, however, has been a decades-long effort to privatize it. Her record of support for vouchers, as well as charter schools that lack adequate accountability and oversight, is very troubling and could lead to diversion of public dollars in even greater amounts out of public education. Now, regardless of any vision or experience of Mrs. DeVos, she is a nominee with, let's say, complex and opaque finances. She has a very opaque record of financial dealings and political giving, including on matters directly related to the work that the department does, which she seeks to lead. Given her and her family's investments in companies that benefit directly from federal education programs, I remain very concerned about what we simply still don't know. I'm also troubled by Mrs. DeVos's and her family's long history of contributing to organizations that have been hostile to the lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender community. Even some of these organizations promoting the discredited idea that sexual orientation or gender identity can be changed through so-called conversion therapy. Now, while she told me and several of my colleagues at our hearing that she believes that all students should be treated equally, I really remain concerned about how this long history of support for these anti-LGBTQ organizations will influence a department which, over the last 8 years, has shown some tremendous leadership in supporting LGBTQ students and parents in the education system. Now, the federal government's primary role in elementary and secondary education is to promote equity. And I'm not convinced that Mrs. DeVos will be the leader that the department needs to do just that. Congress passed the Elementary and Secondary Education Act in 1965 as a civil rights measure. It was designed to ensure that every student, regardless of zip code or parents' income has access to a quality public education. We continued that important tradition in reauthorizing this law, which is now in the form of a very strongly bipartisan bill, the Every Student Succeeds Act. The next Secretary of Education will have to implement that act. And I fear that Mrs. DeVos, as a vocal proponent of state and local control, will not be the strong voice that we need to hold states accountable for serving all students, particularly those who have been historically left behind. And when we passed the Every Student Succeeds Act, we made sure that there were strong federal guardrails to assure that we never forget why there's a federal role in education to begin with, for equity and civil rights, and to make sure